Our story begins with a person running, and it was none other than our protagonist who declared that he was late. At that moment, two people noticed that our protagonist had arrived. Kim Do-won immediately started complaining about the delay. However, Kim Jin pointed out that he was also often late. After arriving, the protagonist apologized for being late, and here are some details about our protagonist. He's a rank D support, and his name is Shin Jan-soo. Continuing, Kim Do-won stated that he was just joking, while Kim Jin explained that Chun-woo and Do-yeon were already inside. However, our protagonist admitted that things were not looking good. It had been 3 months since he joined that guild, and on his very first dungeon raid, he was already late. As they approached the portal, our protagonist thought that he should pull himself together, as this was his first dungeon raid as a support. Moreover, he felt the need to prove that he was useful. At that moment, someone arrived. It was none other than Mundo Yun, who asked if this was his first dungeon. The protagonist confirmed, explaining that it was his first time as a support. However, he had previously been in a dungeon as an assistant. Mundo Yun then explained that supports do not have combat skills like hunters, so he needed to be careful. Additionally, there was a risk of getting dragged into the fight if he got too close. If he stayed too far, they wouldn't be able to defend him, so maintaining a good distance was essential. He clarified that, as a creator, he only needed to stay at a safe distance and craft a dagger for him when signaled. Then, Mundoyan asked, "Did you understand what the protagonist said?" In response, the protagonist asked, "Is that all I need to do?" Mundoyan agreed, explaining that he was the only one who required extra weapons. He then added, "It's an easy dungeon, so there's no need to overburden yourself." However, Lihan stated that he could sense mana, meaning there was a monster nearby. At that moment, their group started preparing for battle, following their formation. Mundoyan asked Lee, "Do you have any observations?" Lee reported, "I detect 3 small mana sources and 1 large one, big enough to be a boss." Hearing this, Mundoyan found it strange. A boss usually didn't lead its designated area. He then declared, "I'll take on the boss while the others deal with the rest." Then, Mundoyan asked, "How long will it take to create a dagger?" And the protagonist responded that it would take 20 seconds, but would only last for less than a minute. However, Mundoyan found that ideal and instructed the protagonist to start making them immediately, declaring that he would finish the fight in 40 seconds. At that moment, crystal lizards appeared, classified as rank D difficulty. Kim Do-won declared, "I'm starting." Activating his ability, he sent the lizards flying. Kim Jin rushed forward, repaired her fist, and punched a lizard. After landing the hit, she swiftly moved away, striking a stylish pose. However, the other crystal lizards advanced. Kim Jin was surprised to see how quickly they regenerated and warned everyone to be careful as 2 were heading in her direction. Kim Do-won then asked about the spell, and Lee confirmed that it was almost ready. A moment later, Lee launched his spell, firing multiple fireballs that caused a massive explosion. Lee confirmed that everything was fine, and Kim Do-won then instructed them to assist. Meanwhile, the protagonist observed everything and remarked, "That was an excellent sequence of attacks." However, Mondo asked about the weapons. The protagonist confirmed they're almost ready. Reminding himself not to get distracted and to focus, the protagonist took a moment to center his thoughts. After a short while, he used his basic creator ability at F-rank creation, utilizing mana to forge objects. At that moment, the protagonist threw a sword to Moon. He quickly caught it and used his A-rank shadow weapon ability to enhance it, improving its overall quality. Meanwhile, the crystal lizard lunged at him. He effortlessly decapitated the monster. Following that attack, the protagonist's creation disappeared. Kim Do-won asked, "Is anyone injured?" Kim confirmed that she was fine. Witnessing all of this, the protagonist admitted, "This is a much better guild than I expected. Moreover, each of you is remarkable. Their teamwork prevented any mistakes in battle." He concluded that if they kept this up, they would become a great guild. However, on the other side, there was him. He declared, "I've done nothing except create the dagger. Other than that, I wasn't very useful." He even questioned whether he deserved to be with them. But then, Moon Do-in approached him and asked, "Are you hurt?" He replied, "No, I'm fine." However, the protagonist explained, "I haven't been truly useful." Nonetheless, Moon Do-in declared that he would save a lot of money thanks to his ability. As he had seen earlier, his ability consumed weapons. Moreover, he could not keep doing that even if he used a cheap dagger. That was why he needed a creator like the protagonist, as his ability worked on any weapon that contained mana. Then he declared once again that he had done well in his first dungeon mission. He told them to keep going and not to run away from them, to which he responded that he would do his best. At that moment, Kim Do-won declared that they should collect the loot and leave. However, the entire environment trembled. Kim Jin even wondered if an earthquake was happening, and Lee asked if the cave was collapsing because they had killed the boss. But pointing his finger, the protagonist asked them to look over there. He explained that the wall was crumbling. However, Lee cast a spell on his staff. He explained that there was something similar to a passage and declared that it must be connected to somewhere. While Moon Do-in thought about it, Kim Do-won could not stay still and declared that it was a secret passage. Furthermore, he explained that there was probably a hidden treasure and urged them to go. Kim Jin also agreed with him. This, however, Lee declared that they could not go inside. But then, Moon Do-in asked, "Can you detect anything?" Lee replied, "I cannot." With that, Moon Do-in saw no problem and said, "Be quick." Seeing the situation, Lee agreed to go as well. Then, Moon Do-in called for our protagonist. However, a moment after entering, our protagonist was running from a monster. "Our entire team is dead. I'm the only one left," the protagonist explained. He continued, "Such a monster shouldn't be in a D-rank dungeon. I've never heard of one that can't be detected by magic." Turning back, the protagonist realized the monster had caught up to him. The monster punched him, sending him flying. He hit the ground, coughing up blood. "I can't die like this," the protagonist declared, struggling to get up. He conjured something, a dagger, and threw it at the monster. However, it had no effect, and the monster attacked fiercely. The monster shattered the ground beneath him, causing the protagonist to fall. As he fell, the protagonist grew anxious about the situation. "I'm just a useless D-rank support," he said. "I can't even use simple skills like healing or buffing." Moreover, when he had finally found a guild that actually needed him, he abandoned them, only to be killed all the same. He explained, "Anyone in my place would have done better." At that moment, he declared, "I should never have awakened." However, the system notified him that he had found something, but it was censored. Moreover, he had met the requirements to become a player. When he opened his eyes, a strong light appeared. Thus, the system welcomed him. After a while, our protagonist opened his eyes again, and the system declared that there was a new reward for him. However, our protagonist understood nothing. Even though he did not understand what was happening, he opened his hand, and so he clicked the systems button. Sometime later, our protagonist returned to the place where he had fallen. The system informed him that he would inherit the experience from his previous stave. Meanwhile, the crystal golem roared. However, the system announced that the reward distribution was complete. Then our protagonist launched several swords at the monster, which consequently collapsed to the ground. On the other side, our protagonist was deep in thought as unknown memories had been placed in his head. But with no time to think much, the monster advanced at him once again. At the very last moment, the protagonist managed to create a barrier. He was astonished to see that the creature showed almost no reaction. Although it resembled a golem, its resilience was extraordinary. Once the barrier broke, the protagonist said if the information from those memories was correct, that even though this creature is golem-like, its weak points and countermeasures should remain the same. Yet, this type of monster had no obvious weaknesses. Even when struck, it possessed the ability to restore itself. Because of this, he needed to deliver attacks from multiple directions at the same time. As a skill-based user, he chose to construct a grid and evenly spaced beams, since anything formed within the grid could move freely under his control. With that, the protagonist unleashed several abilities at once, striking the creature and leaving it heavily damaged. As the smoke cleared, the monster's form dissolved completely. He quietly reflected, "At first, I thought of this grid as nothing more than a support ability that let my creations move faster. But as the proficiency of the skill increased, it could also be used as an offensive ability." At that moment, the system notified him that the boss had been defeated. However, both the boss's name and the dungeon's name were censored. This obviously surprised him. He couldn't see any information about the monsters or the dungeon. Yet in front of him, something seemed to be forming. The system then notified him that the passive skill Magic Absorption had been activated. Looking at it, the protagonist questioned, "What is this?" Then he began to reflect on what had just happened. Memories from his previous game flooded back. Even though he didn't know exactly what it was, there was one thing he was sure of. It was definitely him. And to be more specific, it was him from a few years in the future. In that future, the entire world had collapsed. There were horrible things. Additionally, he had absorbed all the experiences and knowledge from that time. Even if it was the future, it probably wasn't the future of the world he was currently in. Besides, too many things were out of place for this to be happening now, just like the status window in front of him, something he had never been able to understand even in his past life. Seeing all of this, the protagonist questioned how I finally become a player. The term player was used for those who were chosen and awakened. According to him, at this time, players did not exist in this world. However, about 2 years ago, a small number of awakened individuals were selected to become players. With this, a blue screen appeared, visible only to those who were chosen. Yet in the future, a mysterious phenomenon called the system emerged. Something that seemed like a joke but was enough to shock everyone. After all, the system wasn't the only thing given to the players. Each player received different things such as strength and unique abilities. These two things simply appeared out of nowhere. However, players utilized them and experienced explosive growth compared to other awakened individuals. Thanks to the leader who was chosen as a player, the guild he was part of was able to develop and become the first-class guild. Even though he had no direct connection to it, he should remain confident. He had honed his skills and worked harder and harder. He stated that he could now check the abilities he had learned through the system, even though he had always thought it was impractical. However, after thinking for a moment, he realized that he had never had an ability triggered by a dead G. Moreover, he had never heard of it from any other player. It accumulated energy from contaminated mana. Thus, he declared, "I now understand how to obtain that magic." However, he decided to think about it later. For now, his priority was to take care of his body. The scene changed to the Hunter Association headquarters. A woman asked, "Are you sure you let him go? It's strange that a small guild was destroyed after entering an unconfirmed dungeon. Moreover, you're the only one who survived out of the 4 who died." The man replied, "He could have escaped. I took care of the bodies and reported to the association. The portal had disappeared, so we couldn't investigate further." The woman, still suspicious, asked, "What do you think?" "I find all of this strange." The man scoffed, "Do you really think a rank D killed the hunters? Wake up. This isn't a police case. Even if something happened, anything inside a dungeon can't be verified. All we can do is gather evidence." The woman acknowledged, "I know that." The man then stated they could have been one of those people. After all, several hunters have been disappearing after entering unreported portals. Trying to make money and live secretly, it was impossible for small guilds to win a bid for a portal. However, the man told her to call if there was any additional investigation and declared that he was leaving. As he walked out, the man looked at the file stating that his name was Shin Junio. He admitted that he hadn't told her the whole truth because this case felt different from the others. This situation gave him a strange feeling. First of all, he had remained calm the entire time. Moreover, he had no experience in dungeons and had witnessed a tragedy. However, he wasn't panicking, and there were still some missing pieces in between. Obviously, it could be his personality. However, he had seen people like that before. Even though he knew something was off, he didn't know what it was. Nevertheless, it wasn't something he should worry about at the moment, and he affirmed that he would take a good look at it later. At another moment, we see our protagonist walking through the streets. While reflecting on what had happened, he declared that something felt strange. That dungeon didn't exist in the memories of his past life. Moreover, everyone had clearly seen the purchase license for the portal. They had the association's stamp on it. But since it was registered as an unconfirmed portal by the association, someone must have impersonated them and deceived the Dawn Guild. Or maybe the association itself could be involved. However, what worried him the most was that this didn't happen only to the Dawn Guild. After all, cases of missing people had already become a problem. Even though he didn't know the full story, all the guilds mentioned in the news had a common theme. They all include players like Mu Duan and even prodigies who would become heroes in the future. He then declared that there might be someone trying to erase the existence of these heroes. In other words, what he needed to do now was hide his abilities. Moreover, he was the only survivor of a missing persons case, and if he did anything suspicious, he would be caught in the act. He had 2 years until the first player selection to prepare, so he needed to mobilize each of his abilities and develop them by then. However, he needed to find a way to grow without attracting too much attention. Looking at the system window, he noticed there was a usable ability. Pointing his finger at it, he affirmed that he had this one. A year later, somewhere in the forest in the middle of the mountains, the sounds of blows could be heard, and sparks were visible. The hunter struck with his sword, but the monster raised his shield in time, blocking the attack. The impact caused the man's blade to crack, and then it completely shattered, leaving him very nervous. After that, the monster attacked, throwing him backward, but he managed to land successfully, planting the broken sword into the ground to help himself stop. He looked up at the monster. Without giving him time to recover, the monster charged at him, yet he managed to dodge. He landed near his teammates and let out a deep sigh. The enemy turned toward them, casting a fierce glare in their direction. This was the Null Lord, Danger Level D, a high-ranking Null with physical abilities superior to those of an ordinary Null. The hunter stood up, extending his trembling hand forward, questioning what it was doing in an E-rank dungeon. Even D-rank hunters had said this monster was difficult to deal with. At that moment, the Null lunged forward to attack, but the man with the shield reacted in time, stepping up and blocking the attack with his shield. His hands trembled from the powerful impact, and he shouted that they wouldn't be able to hold out for long. Wrong. However, no matter what, they had to at least cause some damage to it. Soon, the swordsman was horrified and explained this is the Grim Reaper of low-rank hunters. But the Null didn't earn that title just because of its physical abilities. Since monsters of this level are vulnerable to magic, any hunting team relies on it. However, this monster defied that logic. The hunters who relied on low-level magic felt fear for the first time. Despite that, the price of their foolishness and pride would usually be the annihilation of their group. They had only one physical damage dealer, but he was bad at close combat and his weapon was broken. Moreover, there were no weapons left, even though the tank had told him to attack. Shocked, he admitted that he had gathered the maximum number of people because of his pride. However, hiring people and a mage ended up screwing him over in this way. Yet the man noticed something. He saw a young man cutting magic stones with a pickaxe. Assistants don't participate in battle. They only collect resources like magic stones and are seen as handymen, with no recognition or respect among the awakened. The hunter suddenly remembered that they had an assistant and thought they were about to die while he was just mining crystals. But then, when he looked closer, something surprised him. The pickaxe in the assistant's hands simply vanished into thin air. He wondered if it was a creation ability, as it would be useful even without high quality, considering they could still use it. He called out to the assistant loudly, and the assistant turned around. It was Junseo. The man approached excitedly. "Are you a creator?" he asked. "Do you know how to make swords?" Juno confirmed this. The man, showing his broken blade, asked him to make a sword, preferably a strong one. Juno apologized and reminded him, "I'm an assistant, not a support." The swordsman trembled. "This isn't the time for that. Don't you realize we're about to die? If we can't handle the boss, we all die." With that, Juno let out a deep sigh. Reluctantly agreeing to the request, he began crafting. "I have one condition," he said. "After we clear the dungeon, you must forget about my ability, and when dividing the loot, I'll receive the same share as a support." He agreed to help if they accepted these terms. The man looked at the new weapon in his hand, surprised. He despised the mediocre quality of someone who had failed as a creator and was now an assistant. Finding it ridiculous to think they could clear a dungeon with just a weapon, Juno smiled and said it was funny. The weapons in the hands of others began to change, and he stated that a good weapon was a necessary element for clearing a dungeon. At that moment, our protagonist affirmed that he would guarantee something. As long as they had this element, they would be able to clear that dungeon. Sometime later, at the Overkill Guild, one of the 3 largest guilds in Korea, a girl named Minhisu walked down the corridor and stopped in front of the enormous doors. She then knocked En Yun Tien, seated at the desk inside the room, allowed her to enter. She addressed him as guild master and informed him that the association had sent a cooperation request. He asked about the errors in dungeon levels, and she confirmed, explaining that it seemed like a standard cooperation request, but with payment as stated. Tien asked if they had a choice because it was difficult to find another awakened individual capable of entering a forcibly closed gate. However, he noticed a familiar face. The system displayed news about an A-rank bug dungeon that had been successfully cleared, and he recognized a familiar face in the team photo. A bug-rank dungeon had appeared in Seotradong a few weeks ago. He had been sent to the area and was on the scene. He had definitely seen him there. The data showed that he was an assistant. Although new dungeons appeared frequently, the chance of a bug occurring in them was still low. The number of cases where there were survivors in bug dungeons could be counted on one hand. Yet, this assistant had been part of a team that had survivors not just once, but twice. He explained that this couldn't be a coincidence. "It seems like more and more bug dungeons are appearing lately," he commented. A D-rank dungeon a few days ago had suddenly turned into a B-rank dungeon, and the entire team had been instantly wiped out. "The Hunter Association must be facing a lot of problems," the leader said. "Many people are criticizing the association." She added, "After all, it's their responsibility to analyze, predict, and announce the dungeon levels." Tainin closed his eyes and rubbed his chin in confusion. He thought that the guy for the association must be struggling a lot right now. He commented on the increasing number of people with the invasion ability and the need to pay extra commissions for a while to monitor the situation. However, Tainin then asked, "What about the request I made you look into?" She responded that she had searched everywhere but couldn't find a single weaponsmith of a rank or higher. However, she had received a B-rank weapon from a Japanese smith and asked if he wanted to test it. He replied that any weapon below a rank would be destroyed. He got up from his chair and began speaking. "Many smiths are just supports," he said. "Keep looking, otherwise I'll continue destroying all the weapons." At that moment, there was a knock on the door. Someone entered the office, saying that something had happened. Taein stood up from his desk and walked toward him, asking what was going on. The person reported that it was an urgent message from the association about a D-rank dungeon, where rookies had entered as a free attack team. Taein asked, "What's the current level?" The person responded, "It's now C-rank." After hearing this, Taein sighed and said, "We can't afford to lose the rookies. It seems like an emergency. I'll go personally." Soon, they arrived at the gate's location, where journalists had gathered. Noticing the presence of the Overkill Guild master, they asked Taein to comment on the dungeon issues and questioned if he had come because of members in his guild. "We're part of the attack team." He ignored them and the concerned girl who had been waiting. She thanked him for coming personally and asked about the situation. She explained that the attack team consisted of 6 hunters, 2 supports, and an assistant. However, the numbers didn't matter since the dungeon was now C rank. He asked, "How long have you been inside?" She replied, "About 2 hours." After approaching the portal, he said, "I don't know how many of them are still alive, but I will do everything in my power." The woman gave a slight bow and thanked him. Then he looked at the gate and threw his case onto the ground. He extended his hand toward the secretary, signaling for her to hand him something. She reached into her bag. A bright light emerged as she pulled out a sword. She was a B-rank support specialized in opening subspaces even in enclosed areas. After that, she handed the weapon to the guild master. At that moment, he delivered a strong strike against the gate. His invasion ability was activated and a small crack appeared on the gate, growing larger within seconds. His ability to forcefully open a path was capable of breaking any barrier, including gates. However, when moving to another dimension, the ability only affected the user. After this strike, his sword broke and he returned it to Hizu's hands, who asked him to be careful. He agreed and then decided to step through the crack in the gate. Inside the dungeon, he stopped immediately and looked around, noticing a change in temperature and increased humidity in the air. From the unpleasant smell, there had to be reptiles living there. The fact that the floor was clean indicated that it was a relatively intelligent monster. Considering the dungeon's level, the answer was quite obvious. Lizardmen were humanoid, reptilian monsters of D rank that lived in tribal groups. They possessed a lifespan proportional to their intelligence and combat strength. Thus, he proceeded to another room, thinking that he could deduce the group's size, combat strength, and assess the danger level as identified in the report. However, it might already be dead by now. As he advanced, he suddenly heard sounds of battle and voices, and he couldn't help but imagine the worst. But when he arrived at the location where the teen was, he saw something unexpected. The monsters were attacking, but the hunters were blocking their strikes and counterattacking immediately. Acting in perfect coordination as a team, a girl shot an arrow that pierced through one of the monsters. Tan was surprised, wondering if they were actually winning. From the hunters' movements, the lizardmen were visibly stronger. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted when he saw, in the next moment, one of the monsters knocking the weapon out of a hunter's hands. The man looked up in terror, realizing that he was about to receive a powerful strike. Tan rushed to help him, thinking that it wasn't too late yet. But then, suddenly, the lizardman launched its attack. Its strike, however, was stopped by a sword that appeared out of nowhere, leaving the creature deeply surprised. The hunter's breath quickened with fear, while the guildmaster, who was running to assist him, stopped and thought it might be magic. He quickly dismissed that idea upon realizing that it was a weapon created in midair. Still, he wanted to know who had made it. He turned and saw the assistant near the crystals, the one who had conjured the sword. Noticing Tahan's gaze, Judo turned his head slightly, and their eyes met. He looked at the team members fighting against the monsters and began counting them. When he counted a total of 9 people, he shifted his gaze to Taeyin and pointed a finger at him. "You're the 10th, he said. Taeyin frowned. "This is strange," he muttered. "I clearly remember only 9 entered." The guildmaster, visibly annoyed, asked, "What are you doing?" At that moment, one of the team members blocked an incoming attack. However, the monster was stronger and sent him flying backward. The mage immediately rushed to help him, while the lizardman raised its sword high above its head, preparing to strike. Seeing this, Taeyin grew concerned. Without hesitation, he drew his sword and moved to engage. Meanwhile, Judah looked at his open case. He hadn't expected young Taeyin to come personally to assist them. He noticed that Taeyin had brought an extra weapon. The hot wind caused by Taeyin's strike brushed against its face. Junu quickly covered his blade in flames, pressing harder against the opponent's sword. With a final push, he broke through its defense and ordered the hunters behind him to retreat. The mage helped his teammate up and thanked him for the assistance. After that, Taeyin disarmed his opponent. He reignited the flames and charged forward, delivering powerful strikes. Soon, the monster's body was covered in numerous cuts, from which green blood gushed until its corpse fell to the ground with a heavy thud. Kaan explained that despite being a B-rank weapon, it still hadn't reached its full potential. He lifted his gaze and saw the lizard man charging toward him. The monster attacked, and Taeyin defended himself before leaping backward. He stopped beside Juno, who called his name. He asked if this happened every time he used his skill because it seemed very exhausting. The others rushed toward the monster, and the guild leader asked if he was asking for trouble. Suddenly, blue sparks appeared in front of his face, and a weapon was created from them. "Take it," Judio said, handing it to him. "And don't destroy my poor weapon." Taeyin looked at the sword in surprise. Junio had materialized it with a single gesture. Taeyin stated that he was an extremely skilled weapon creator. He noticed the pickaxe in his hand and questioned if he was an assistant, recalling that low-rank supports sometimes entered dungeons in that role. But suddenly, the protagonist interrupted his thoughts. He took the broken sword from Taehyun's hand and said there was a condition. After clearing and leaving the dungeon, you have to forget about me and my abilities. Taehyun reached out for the new sword and asked, "Do you really think you can just forget because you want to?" In response, Junseo began to destroy the sword. If not, he said, then let me go and cut everyone down with this high-class weapon. The guildmaster sighed, thinking the weapon would break as soon as a spill was used on it. Having a few more wouldn't hurt. He took the sword and replied, "I understand everything. I also promise to forget about it." At that, Juno smiled and affirmed, "You can go." The guildmaster then rushed to attack and approached the enraged lizard man. He ignited the sword with a bright flame and struck, causing massive flames to erupt around them. The monster used more force to try to withstand the attack, but in the end, its sword broke. Taehyun thought he had only wanted to counter the attack, but his opponent's weapon had broken first. He looked at his blade, noticing his control was visibly better than usual. He wondered if the weapon itself was stronger. Then he looked at Juno, who was collecting crystals at that moment. Taehyun was surprised, realizing Juno was capable of manifesting a weapon above B rank. At that moment, the monster decided to attack him with the broken weapon. Raising its sword above its head to strike, Taehyun prepared himself, thinking this was interesting. He wanted to see what the weapon was capable of. He stated that he would increase the power. With these thoughts, he plunged the tip into the monster's abdomen. The blade's flames pierced through the monster's body, emerging in a bright flash. Without wasting time, the guildmaster pushed himself off the monster's shoulder and jumped behind it. Then he leaped upward, raising his sword above him, igniting it once more. He drove the blade into the monster's head, piercing it. The monster screamed loudly, blood gushed from its mouth, and its body collapsed to the ground. At that moment, Taehyun noticed there wasn't a single scratch on him. At least he needed that. But he was interrupted by someone calling him. It was people thanking Taehyun for his presence, as they had only survived because of him. He walked up to them and said it seemed like no one was seriously injured, which made him happy. One of the men turned his attention to Junseo and said, "With your weapon, we wouldn't have even been able to fight, but we endured thanks to you." The guild leader himself turned his gaze toward him, thinking about something. Then he approached and asked for his name. The protagonist questioned the reason for the question. He stated that they should know each other's names to call each other properly, introducing himself as Yun Taehyun. While closing his backpack, Juno turned to him, stood up, and approached stating his name. Looking at the man behind him, he said he would lead the stone man at the entrance. The man agreed with a confused expression. As Juno was about to leave, Taehyun stopped him and asked him to wait, offering to go with him to the boss room. He took the backpack from his hands, and Junseo stated that he was just an assistant. The guild leader handed the backpack to another man, explaining that a dungeon bug prevented them from exiting without defeating the boss. So, he explained that he could take care of it. At that moment, Taehyun stated that no weapon was capable of fully withstanding his skill. However, breaking the weapons he had made for himself would be pointless. The protagonist replied with a hint of irritation that his weapon wouldn't break, to which Taehyun responded that he thought the same and explained that they were in a bug dungeon. The creatures living there weren't ordinary lizard men, and if the boss was the same, then extra caution wouldn't hurt. Junio sighed heavily. Deciding to agree, he threw the backpacks on the ground. As soon as he approached him, he asked, "Is all I have to do is follow along?" Soon, they found themselves in a large hall, illuminated by torches. Frozen at the entrance, they saw a throne at the far end, where the C++ danger level lizard lord was seated. Taehyun explained that they should ignore the existing danger levels and any information about them. With a smile, he added, "We'll finish this as quickly as possible." Both activated their abilities. Taehyun warned that the weapon would break apart, to which the protagonist replied, "I've already ensured that won't happen." Then the Lizard King extended his hand toward them. He pointed the tip of his spear at them, ordering his lizards to charge and attack. As soon as the lizard men attacked, both jumped backward. Taehyun propelled himself off the wall and surged forward. The Lizard Lord noticed this. When Taehyun landed too close, the beast swung its claw. At that moment, Taehyun held his sword in front of him. Just then, the monster whipped its tail forward, sending a powerful gust of wind in his direction. Forcing him to increase the distance between them, he then pushed off and ran again. This time, the Lizard Lord was charging straight at him. Their blades collided with a loud crash, and both pulled back again. However, the Lord mounted his Lizard Man, which began to spew tongues of fire from its mouth. A powerful jet of fire shot toward the man. He wanted to block the attack with his sword, but Judio created a shield in front of him just in time, protecting him from the intense blast. He himself stood off to the side, observing the fight. At that moment, the lizardman charged, throwing Taehyun backward. Landing beside Junseo, he asked, "Aren't you just a weapon creator?" The protagonist responded, "A shield can also become a weapon." He ignited his sword with flames and smiled. Once we get out of here, I'll have many questions for you. After those words, he ran toward his opponent. The Lizard Lord swung his hand, launching a chain from his spear, which had a shark tip. The chain struck the sword and coiled around the blade. Then the Lizard Lord pulled his hand back, dragging the enemy toward him. Tangen was pulled directly toward the open mouth of a lizard man. Seeing this, Juno extended his hand forward and told him, "Stop messing around and fight." He deconstructed the weapon. Tan, letting go of it, asked with a smile, "Didn't I request to test it?" A new weapon appeared in his hand, and the exhausted protagonist told him, "Take care of your pet." After that, the chain weapon, which had not yet vanished, flew over the lizardman's head. Tan delivered several slashes to its mouth. Seeing the blood splatter, the monster was startled. Then the man threw a sword at it, but the monster managed to dodge just in time. In the blink of an eye, Tan got very close and kicked it with all of his strength, sending it flying to the side. The Lizard Lord fell off the back of his lizard men. At that moment, Tahan saw it high in the air, swinging his sword and igniting it once again. What the monster saw made it nervous. It had no time to react before receiving a powerful strike that severed its arm. Realizing it wouldn't be able to fight back, it turned its gaze toward Juno, who had not participated in the battle. Grabbing its spear, it charged straight at him, but the protagonist was prepared for this. And just before the attack landed, he raised his shield in front of him, making the monster anxious. The protagonist then asked with displeasure who had thought it was a good idea to point a weapon at him. At that moment, Tahan appeared behind the monster, engulfed in blazing flames. The Lizard Lord didn't know what to do. It was trapped from both sides. Meanwhile, the people outside continued to watch the gate. Seeing the color change to blue, they rejoiced as it meant the gate was opening. After that, the guild team emerged from the portal. The journalist immediately rushed to Tahan, eager to know what was inside the dungeon and what had happened to the boss. The guards surrounded him, and Heizu asked if he was injured, to which he replied that he was fine. His guild members thanked him from behind for his help, with the girl saying that if not for him, she would already be dead. Meanwhile, Juno handed the collected resources to the man and said that since he had already received his payment in advance, he needed to leave. The protagonist, giving one last glance at the team, simply departed. One of the journalists, in the meantime, approached the guild leader and asked how he had managed to clear the dungeon so quickly. He turned around and said, "I wasn't alone there." But when he didn't see Juno behind him, he froze. The man asked, "Did you do that?" While everyone was somehow blocking together with teamwork, which allowed him to handle all of them. The warrior beside him said, "Our weapons broke. If it weren't for the guild leader, we would have been destroyed a long time ago." Upon hearing this, Tahan explained, "It's thanks to those people who kept making weapons for us that we've lasted this long." The man responded, "I was talking about the support who was there as an assistant. He was also a weapon creator." Still confused, the warrior stated, "I knew someone had helped the support." He then turned to the girl and asked, "Do you have that ability?" She replied, "I'm not sure." After hearing their answers, Tahan turned to the rest of the team and asked, "Haven't you seen him create weapons?" They looked at the backpacks they had left behind where the pickaxe should have been. Someone commented, "He doesn't even have one." Another team member replied he did have a pickaxe, but he must have lost it. Still, he collected all the mana stones. Tan was confused and wondered what had happened. After all, he had created weapons for all of them, yet it seemed they had forgotten about it. He remembered how Junseo had asked him to forget everything about weapon creation, and he wondered in surprise if that was rental payment. However, he questioned how someone could use a skill exclusive to rank or higher creators. His friends called him, not understanding what was wrong. After that, he tossed the weapon case into his vice leader's hands and ran off to look for Junio. He and his secretary watched him confused. He kept running and looking around, wondering where Jan Su had gone, questioning if he had really disappeared. Suddenly, he stopped. Juno was nearby, hiding behind a brick wall. Seeing that no one else was around, Taiyan realized he wouldn't be able to catch up to him. At that moment, his guild members ran up to him, asking what happened. He turned to Heizu and said that he needed to find someone now. Then, a scene showed our protagonist leaving. Time passed, and soon, Heizu arrived at the guild leader with the news that she had determined Shin Juno's location. He entered a D-rank dungeon near Seg around 1 o'clock p.m. with a group of 5 people. Taeyeon then told her she had done a great job. However, Heizu questioned why. I thought he was interested in the protagonist. Taeyeon looked at the tablet and asked, "Do you really think that way?" He considered it. Of course, Junseo was a D-rank creator. Otherwise, it would be hard to imagine. He reviewed his general information and thought that, according to all records, he was ranked D, but he also had rental payment, and that skill refuted everything. Rental payment was an A-rank skill. The rental payment ability was incredibly powerful. Taeyeon stated that he had never seen anyone use it like Juno did. Furthermore, Juno was using it to hide his true abilities. A weapon creator like him could level up easily. but Tadian would find out when he met him. At that moment, he felt something he had never felt before. He recalled the sensation of holding the sword Juno had created. He thought he could fight with full strength without worrying about the weapon breaking. Despite getting many swordsmiths considered the best, he had never experienced anything like it. Whenever they presented their latest products, he would take them with hope and try using his skill on them. Even though those smiths were confident in their work, as soon as he delivered a powerful fire strike, he was immediately disappointed. All the weapons broke. In the end, the smiths who had been so confident in their products ended up holding their heads in frustration, watching as their items were destroyed. None of the weapons met Tadian's expectations, not to mention the creation skill was limited to normal weapon types. But Junio had created something that greatly surpassed that limitation of type and ability. It was as if there were no restrictions. With Junio's skill, this was possible, something he hadn't used because he hadn't had the right weapon. The time required to clear a D-rank dungeon with 5 people was 4 hours, leaving just 1 hour remaining. He stood up and asked Hizu what was still on the schedule. She explained that he had a meeting with Guildmaster Kenmu. However, he told her to cancel the meeting because he was leaving early. He wanted to make sure he didn't miss the opportunity. Meanwhile, inside the dungeon, the teen was fighting against orcs. A warrior pierced one of them in the stomach, causing its death, and watched the corpse fall. He was soon surprised by the capability of that creation and questioned whether it was really something made by an assistant. If that amount of mana could destroy a boss's weapon, it had to be at least a C-rank ability, or maybe even higher. With the weapon shattered, he thought they were done for, but he never imagined that his assistant had such a... He picked up the sword and laughed loudly. "This is simply impressive," he said. He had never seen a sword of such high quality. He looked at Juno and thanked him for his help. Then he turned to the girl and asked, "Aren't you in any guild? Maybe we should recruit you into ours." She smiled. "That would be a great idea," she replied. "But I do find it a bit shameful for you to be just an assistant." "Is that true?" she asked. He laughed in response. "You had a sharp eye," he said. Upon hearing their conversation, the protagonist realized he had used more mana than he had initially thought. He reflected on how much the team had struggled, how much they had led. Even though the dungeon hadn't been a complete failure, he walked toward the place where mana stones grew. He threw his backpack onto the ground, thinking that if he had had more mana back then, everything would have been different. In that dungeon, he had felt an incredible amount of mana, more than ever before, but after defeating the golem and exhausting all of his mana, it never reappeared. What he felt now was nothing more than the mana of a D-rank awakened. Still, he felt relieved knowing there was no issue with creating weapons. He created a pickaxe and looked at it. Who would have thought memories could be so useful? He mused. The basic ability of a creator was the creation of special items. The quality of an item depends on the amount of mana used. Although it seems like a simple skill, there is still a way to enhance its efficiency, known as the level of comprehension. The higher the comprehension level, the better the quality of the created item. The strength of this ability lies in the fact that improving quality makes mana use more efficient, allowing the same object to be made with varying quality depending on one's understanding. He recalled his training when he discovered this hidden aspect, studying materials, practicing with guidance, and attending lessons on crafting. The results exceeded his expectations, which encouraged him to start gathering mana stones to refine his skills further. At first, he wasn't sure how much of a difference it made, but compared to the mana consumed, the improvement was clearly more than just a small increase. Still, it wasn't enough. Using creation while managing mana at the same time remained difficult. Equipment that enhanced mana was far too expensive to afford at the moment. At the very least, he could still purchase mana recovery potions, the only widely available product designed for this purpose. However, with the modest income of an assistant, even that was a challenge, and with limited abilities, finding someone willing to hire him was nearly impossible. He opened the window displaying the passive mana absorption ability, and thought the result wasn't bad. It was reassuring. He was very close to reaching the 20% mana absorption goal. Clearing several dungeons wouldn't be enough. A protected dungeon yielded just over 1%, a very low efficiency. There was only one option left, the bug dungeon. That was the only way to absorb a large amount of mana at once. Compared to other dungeons, it absorbed several times more mana. He explained that before he could enter, he wasn't able to predict the difficulty of the rank error in the dungeon. Moreover, it would be difficult for him if Tahan wasn't there. He considered finding a dungeon with a C-rank boss to prepare, since growing as a D-rank awakened depended on understanding the value of mana absorption. Soon, the team successfully cleared the dungeon and went outside. Everyone thanked each other for their cooperation and said their goodbyes. The protagonist, realizing that they hadn't said a word about his ability, was pleased that he had erased their memories. Suddenly, a familiar voice calling his name made him freeze. He immediately turned around and saw the leader of the Overkill Guild approaching. Along with the secretary, Tahan asked if he remembered him. Upon hearing that, the protagonist realized the ability hadn't worked on him. He sighed deeply and asked, "Would you believe me if I said I don't remember?" Taehan handed him a business card and replied, "I wouldn't believe it." The protagonist took the card and asked, "Why did you come?" Taehan answered, "I need to talk to you about something. I just need a minute of your time." Looking at the information on the card, the protagonist thought, Overkill is one of the best guilds in Korea. I can't join such a large guild yet. He still needed to find an excuse to leave. After putting the card in his pocket, he turned around. "I don't have time," he said. "I'm in a hurry for an important meeting." But Taehan wasn't going to let him go so easily. He placed a hand on the protagonist's shoulder, saying, "You won't regret this conversation. It won't take long, and I'll even pay for dinner." Jung remarked, "Being a guild leader must free up a lot of time if you're spending it on a D-rank support." The protagonist looked at him closely, thinking, "I don't like this very much," but he needed to check how the rental payment worked for him. As he walked past Taehan, he finally agreed to talk, but only if it was quick. Taehan smiled and agreed. After that, they arrived at a restaurant and got a table in a private room. But the table was set with several dishes. The protagonist asked why a guild leader would speak with a D-rank support. He doubted it was just because Taehan had free time to talk to him. Taehan said that from what he had seen, Juno was a berserker. Due to his incredible strength, he needed a weapon that could withstand such force. So the most important part of a berserker's job was to find a supplier of suitable weapons. Obviously, Juno had gone to many places searching for them, traveling across the country and beyond. He had started with a blacksmith considered the best in his field and ended with the few remaining weapon creators. If there was even the slightest opportunity, he would commission a weapon. Time and money didn't matter. However, all the weapons Juno had used so far had failed to fully withstand his abilities. But there was only one exception, the sword that the protagonist had created. The protagonist understood one thing: the agreement had no effect on him. He had realized that the berserker had a nullification ability. He had been too careless. He needed to be more careful when using that ability on high-rank hunters. Taehan called his name and with a serious expression said he would ask directly. He then asked if the protagonist would like to join his guild, surprising Hizu. He stated that he already knew Junio wasn't a member of any guild. If he joined, Taehan promised he would receive the best treatment. They would pay 10 billion for his entry, cover operational costs separately, and provide dividends with a 1-year contract and a 10% increase for each renewal. Juno didn't let him finish. He stood up from the table and apologized. "I have no plans to join a guild for now," he said, "so I'll have to decline. If that's all, I'm leaving." He thanked Taehan for the meal with a slight smile and left the room. Taehan called out, trying to stop him. Hizu asked, "Why did you make such an offer? You couldn't have done it without a reason." She was about to say something more about the conditions, but he interrupted her. "If you'd experienced the same thing I have, you wouldn't be saying that. It's been a long time since I felt the cry of a weapon. And with a weapon like that, it felt like he could do anything." It endured. She wanted to say something to him, but as he took a drink, he said that of course it wasn't just because of that feeling. He then asked how many high-level weapons had broken in a single year. His words reminded her of the astronomical amounts he spent on weapons. Even though they broke because they couldn't withstand the strain, if the weapon wasn't of a certain rank, it wouldn't allow the guild leader to use his abilities. After thinking about it, she agreed with him and said that if it were possible, then such a price for a contract was truly insignificant. But for now, the problem was that no one was capable of such a thing, not even among those considered the best. However, he didn't let her finish. He said that Junio definitely could. She was startled by those words, and he continued, saying that no matter what Junio asked for, he wanted to recruit him at any cost. Time passed, and the protagonist walked down the street. However, he was still in disbelief after having rejected such an offer. The Overkill Guild and Yun tie-in. This would have helped him a lot, but it was still too soon. However, he just needed to be patient. He would definitely meet him again. Meanwhile, in an unknown dungeon, several goblin corpses were scattered across the floor. Hunter watched as his companion had a limb torn off. Catching his breath, he looked nervously at the one who had done it and asked, "Who are you?" The man drove his sword into the hunter's body and said, "It's quite amusing. In moments like these, people whine and beg to be saved. But the one who would become the hero," he continued with a smile, "is different." He looked at the only survivor. The boy asked, "Why did you suddenly want to kill us and take the trophy?" The man replied, "It wasn't that boring. I just don't feel like telling you." He pulled the sword from the corpse and added, "Telling someone about to die would be useless, but I'll reveal it if you manage to defeat me." With a smile, he threw the sword over his shoulder. "Come quickly, if you don't want to die." The hunter gritted his teeth. He knew he was facing a difficult opponent. Staying at a distance meant certain death. He had to close the gap. With a loud cry, he charged forward, thinking, "I have to go for it, even if I lose an arm or a leg." In response, the man raised his sword, blocking the strike. The hunter shouted, putting all his strength into it. Then he began delivering new attacks, but they were all parried, sparks flying as their swords clashed. Suddenly, the man knocked the weapon out of his opponent's hands. Sending it flying high above his head, the hunter looked at the sword in shock. Then, his opponent kicked him with full force, sending him across the hall. The hunter crashed against the wall, trembling in pain. "It's sad," he said. Dragging his sword along the ground, the man spoke. "I volunteered for this because it was the first-rank domination of a hero. But I didn't know I'd turn out to be such a small fish. Still, the courage I showed was worthy of praise." When his shadow loomed over him, the hunter begged for forgiveness, tears filling his eyes. "Please, have mercy," he pleaded. The man didn't care. He raised his sword above him, smiling, "I'll deal with you now." Then, with one swift motion, he delivered a fatal blow. A torrent of blood gushed out. He looked down at the hunter with disappointment and cursed. "I thought, for the first time in a long while, I have a real fight, but this wasn't even a warm-up." He questioned the look of injustice on the hunter's face, then smirked. "Don't worry. I'll make sure to say you fought bravely against the boss and died a hero." Taking out his phone, he snapped a picture of the corpse. It's common in a dungeon with a rank error," he said, smiling. After finishing, he looked through the photos. He said they weren't bad. The collection had grown. Scrolling through the images of the other dead bodies, he added that his whole life was dedicated to collecting. Suddenly, for some reason, he felt a shiver run down his spine. He told the priestess with disgust, "I hate feeling that vile energy." He ordered her to either conceal it or stop hiding it. The hall doors opened and the priestess entered, waving at him with a smile. She apologized. "I'm in a hurry. However, there were valuable components here." He pulled the sword from the corpse and replied, "There are only idiots here." She walked past him before he could finish speaking, and with a threatening tone asked, "Does that mean you want to go against the will of the executive?" He sighed in irritation, calling her sensitive. "Clean up the place." She used her abilities, agreeing, "I'm an expert at it." With a grim expression, he reminded her of her promise. "You said you'd send me after an S-rank hunter." Because of that awareness, or whatever it was, he needed to kill him, but he couldn't use his full power. So he followed her only for that reason. The priestess approached the hunter's corpse, and creating a magic circle over it, she assured him that he didn't need to worry, as she would contact him soon. A glow appeared in the corpse's womb, and he asked, "Who will it be this time?" A claw emerged from the dead hunter's body as the monster surfaced. The priestess, with an admiring smile, called it a child and happily exclaimed, "You're right." A tall humanoid monster, whose body burned with energy, appeared before her. Time passed, and a new day began. Association guards and curious onlookers gathered around the open gates. Judio, who had just arrived, noticed someone familiar and looked at him with displeasure. Taein, who was also there, adjusted his cap and asked, "Is it really you?" Silence hung between them. After a brief pause, the protagonist asked, "What are you doing here?" Taein replied, "You got good eyesight to recognize me so quickly." Observing the case on his back, he commented, "I only know one person who carries a weapon like that, so what are you doing here?" Taein responded, "The guild member who was supposed to come suddenly fell ill, so I was sent in their place." The protagonist didn't believe him and was about to question him further when one of the team members called out. Saying it was time to leave, Taein passed by him and suggested they enter the dungeon. The protagonist stated, "I knew I would meet you again, but I hadn't expected it to be so soon." He decided to accept the situation and adjust his plans. Thus, they passed through the gates and found themselves in a spacious cave. Taein asked, "Why didn't you join a guild?" He replied, "I already refused, and I didn't want to talk about it anymore." One of them then asked if they had heard about the gate auction that took place in Chunin that morning. The man stated, "I heard the Hayama Guild won. A friend was there and said they placed such a high bid that no one dared to compete." Juno became interested, wondering, did they really find something there? Taein asked, "Are you interested in buying a gate? If you join a guild, you could easily acquire special gates above B rank." This wasn't just because of resources, but also because the guild's name granted certain privileges. Joining a guild meant a lot for an awakened individual. People admired and revered major guilds. A hunter not only gains employment, but also earns better income and rewards compared to others. By becoming part of a guild, the hunter enjoys various benefits from its influence. For example, they can gain access to special gates that require not only skill, but also strong political connections. With this structure, the rare treasures obtained in such places are naturally monopolized by the major guilds. Taein stated that Junio probably had a goal as an awakened. Whatever it was, it would be easier to achieve with Overkill. He didn't understand why Junio kept refusing. The protagonist sharply replied, "It's none of your business." He understood why Taein was acting this way. Probably no one had ever rejected an offer to join Overkill before. So to make it clear, he added, "I won't join any guild under any circumstances." These words surprised Taein, who stood still for a moment. He thought, was it because of the injury he received after the destruction of the Dawn Guild, as he had read in the report, or something else? Whatever it was, he couldn't give up. Time passed as they advanced through the cave. The mage at the front began illuminating the path. They looked around when suddenly a man bumped into something and exclaimed, "What is this?" He touched his hair. Feeling a thread-like texture between his fingers, he asked, "Is this a web?" The girl raised her staff, casting more light into the area. The team leader stepped forward and said, "This is where the monster territory begins." It seemed that all the hunters there were rookies, so he briefly explained, even though they had all read the report. The spider legionnaires began to emerge. Although each creature had a low difficulty level, their peculiarity was that they lived in groups. According to Reconnaissance analysis, there were about 50 of them, which wasn't too many. The hunters were warned about the paralyzing venom in the creature's fangs and were alerted not to let themselves be bitten. Taein crouched, pulled the sword from its case, and turned to Juno. "The creatures are about to appear. Stay close," he said. The protagonist, with a sarcastic smile, replied, "I don't need to worry about an assistant. Just prepare for the fight." However, Taein stated, "All combat units have the responsibility to protect supports and assistants, regardless of skill or situation. That's a rule every hunter follows." Juno's expression turned unsatisfied, retorted that no one else adhered to principles like that anymore, but his words were interrupted by a shout from a team member announcing the creature's arrival. The noises grew louder, and everyone immediately prepared, lifting their eyes to the ceiling. The sharp sounds of the spider's claws echoed as they approached, moving along the walls and ceiling. Upon seeing the monsters, the swordsmen trembled with fear. They tried to calm themselves, reminding themselves that they would win if they followed what they had learned. Thus, the Spider Legionnaires appeared, individually classified as E-rank threats, but in groups, they reached D rank, increasing in danger as their numbers grew. A horde of creatures advanced rapidly, and the hunters braced themselves for battle. The swordsman assumed a stable stance and, with a precise strike, took down a spider, gritting his teeth and attacking again. Meanwhile, another hunter blocked the monsters with his shield, concentrating energy and repelling them with a powerful strike. The mage used her magic, creating sparks from her staff that pierced the enemies. Observing the battle, Tahan concluded that despite being rookies, they were performing well, which gave him concern. Junseo, who was watching the other side of the corridor, sighed in surprise, catching Tahan's attention. He turned, and Juno commented, "It seems like there are far more than just a few dozen spiders." At that moment, several of them jumped from the ceiling, attacking the group. Taein activated his skill, swinging his sword and burning multiple creatures. Their charred bodies fell to the ground. He continued his assault, reflecting that the durability of these spiders was lower compared to other monsters. Just by releasing a little energy from his sword, he could eliminate them without even using the blade. This allowed him to finish the raid without damaging his weapon. Meanwhile, cries for help came from another direction. 3 team members were surrounded by a large group of spiders, making the fight increasingly difficult. The team leader exclaimed, "The number of enemies is far greater than expected." Who did the reconnaissance? There weren't just 50 spiders. There were hundreds. The situation worsened, and the mage announced that she was running out of mana. Determined to help, Taein ran toward them, calling Juno to follow. However, the protagonist went in the opposite direction, saying, "It's better for me to help the others while I finish." There, he joined the group. Later, Taein stopped, confused, as he watched him walk toward the monsters. When a spider leaped to attack him, Taein ran forward, worried. He shouted for him to get down, thinking that without using energy on his sword, he might get hurt. But at that moment, Juno stopped, closed his eyes, and when he opened them, his irises had changed color, reflecting a web forming on the ceiling. The spider that had entered the web was immediately impaled by a sharp blade. Taein was stunned by the scene. The spider's body fell at Junu's feet, and he calmly analyzed the situation. Among all the weapons he could create at that moment, the sword would be of the highest quality. It would be more efficient to create multiple swords and use them simultaneously, but with his current mana reserves, that was impossible. With a slight movement of his finger, he pulled the sword from the spider's body, pointed it forward, and thought there was nothing better he could do at that moment. At his command, the sword rose into the air and began spinning around him, waiting for his next order. Observing the nearby monsters, he turned and pointed his finger at them, setting the sword hurling forward. As it approached the monsters, the sword pierced through one spider in its path and then moved on to the next, cutting swiftly. With just a flick of his hand, Juno controlled the sword, making it sweep through the cavern at a furious speed. At one point, he raised his finger toward the ceiling, pointing at the remaining spiders. After that, the sword shot forward and spun around them like a tornado, piercing everything in its path. When it was over, Tahan looked at him in shock, then at the many corpses lying at his feet. He shifted his gaze to the sword embedded in the spider's body. wondering confused if that was some kind of area attack. He watched the sword dissolve and reflected that in less than 10 seconds of combat, Juno had dealt with dozens of spiders. Had he used materialization in battle? Taeyeon didn't even know that supports could fight like that. Noticing his stare, Juno pointed a finger toward the rest of the group and asked, "What are you doing? Aren't you going to help them?" Because of his words, Taeyeon suddenly remembered the other teammates he had initially run to help. He turned and saw that they were barely managing to stay on their feet, realizing the situation wasn't great. He activated his ability and said they would talk after everything was over. Before leaving, Jensen called out to him and pointed at the bodies behind him, asking him to take care of them. After all, they wouldn't think an assistant had done all that anyway. Taeyeon lowered his mask, thinking about it for a second. Then he pushed off the ground and moved forward, burning the bodies. Soon, the battle was over and the team members gathered to rest. One of the hunters thanked Taeyeon for his help, saying they had survived thanks to him. But he was a bit surprised. At first, he thought Taeyeon looked familiar, but who would have guessed he was the master of the Overkill Guild? Taeyeon apologized for not mentioning it sooner and explained that he wanted to explore the dungeon discreetly. The mage was thrilled to discover his true identity and thanked him. Then she admiringly said, "It was incredible to watch you handle all those spiders." A little embarrassed, she hesitantly asked, "Would it be possible to take a picture with you once we get out?" The hunter, who had returned with Junio, cut her off before she could finish, loudly announcing that they were back. She made a disappointed expression, thinking she had lost a golden opportunity. The young man smiled apologetically for the delay. They began collecting secondary resources and walked around the area. It seemed there were no more monsters left. He pointed to a dark corridor and said, "There's another passage over there." He thought they could move forward. The leader sighed heavily. "I don't think we're in any condition to continue clearing the dungeon," he said. "It's a shame, but we should wrap it up here." The swordsman exclaimed in surprise, "We're so close. Why have you decided that?" The man stood up, crossed his arms over his chest, and said, "The number of spiders we've encountered, the dungeon's geography, and everything else are different from the intelligence report. Dungeons exist as portals separate from the world. They are areas with strange creatures and geographical features that can't be found on Earth. Currently, the concept of dungeons and awakened beings is not fully defined. For novice hunters, information about dungeons is the most important thing. Few awakened individuals can adapt to a dungeon if they've never encountered one before. That means defeat, and in the worst-case scenario, death. That's how explorers came to be. Awakened individuals with detection or stealth abilities band together and begin gathering information about dungeons. The rank of a strong dungeon increases after such reconnaissance, and thus they began to be called explorers. The accuracy of these reconnaissance missions generally exceeds 98%. It is unlikely that this is just an error. One cannot rule out that this might also be a misclassified dungeon. The swordsman was confused and wanted to argue, but then he turned his gaze to Taeyeon and asked, "With the guild master with us, do you think we might still be able to continue?" The man said he understood that they wanted to keep clearing the dungeon, but the guild master's help alone would be enough. "If we're not careful," he continued, "everyone could end up in danger." Frustrated, the young man said, "I really want to clear the dungeon. I have personal reasons." He paused and asked, "Is there really no way?" The girl also expressed her frustration. "I want to finish the dungeon," she said. He asked, "What could be more important than our lives? If we enter the boss room, there will be no turning back." He also didn't want to leave, but added, "We need to report the situation first." The guild leader then joined the conversation and said he agreed with them. The team leader looked at him with a confused expression, and Taeyeon stated that, even though he was there to study everything, he was still a member of the group. If the leader decided to continue clearing the dungeon, he had no reason to object. However, if he wanted to study everything, he would have to enter the boss room. He glanced at Juno, who nodded in agreement. The man bowed and said, "I will trust you with this." Thanking him, he started to talk about being the team leader, but Taeyeon reassured him, asking him to continue leading. The man agreed and announced that they would move forward. He instructed the others to follow, and as they passed through a large corridor, they found themselves in front of a set of doors. The leader stopped and informed them that he believed they had reached the boss room, so he would give some final instructions. First, the boss of this dungeon is a Legion Queen Spider, ranked D+, with considerably high combat abilities. It is considered a relatively easy boss, mainly focused on birthing Legion spiders. However, those are just the initial reports, and no one knows what kind of creature will actually be behind that door. He pushed the doors open, announcing, "We are entering." As the doors slowly swung open, they illuminated the space. The group moved forward. As they advanced, Taeyeon frowned, realizing he couldn't sense any particular presence, nothing at all. The leader raised his shield in front of him and warned the group to prepare. That's when they spotted a massive spider hanging from the ceiling. He shouted, "It's the boss." At that moment, the swordsman asked, Is that the queen spider we talked about? Relieved, the mage commented, "Good. The boss is as expected." She gripped her staff and declared, "I'll attack first." She conjured a sphere of sparks and launched it forward, striking all the monsters with an electric shock. With a satisfied smile, she clenched her fist, but her eyes soon widened in shock. The queen spider's body fell to the ground, torn apart with half of its abdomen missing. This clearly wasn't caused by the mage's attack. Seeing this, the team leader became nervous, wondering if the boss was already dead. He had never heard of something like this before. Realizing something was wrong, he ordered the group to retreat. But they all felt a powerful pressure coming from the corpse and wondered what it was. Another queen's leg landed on the torn abdomen of the spider. She let out a loud cry. She spread her arms wide and summoned her army. It was Araken, a B+ ranked queen who ruled over all types of spider monsters. She possessed high intelligence, was extremely cunning, and did not reproduce. Instead, she invaded the territories of other similar monsters, expanding her army at their expense while also sharing her power with her subordinates. Iraqi smiled as she observed the frightened people, and then swung her leg to finish them off. However, suddenly, a flame emerged in her path. Tahan blocked her strike with a swing of his sword and stared at her, thinking how he would never have expected this monster to appear here. He knew that without swordsmanship skill, he wouldn't even be able to scratch her. With just one strike, his sword had already cracked, and he reflected that he needed to inflict as much damage as possible with a single attack. He then advanced, delivering a strike to the monster's abdomen, but his blade shattered instantly, making him curse in his mind. Despite that, he left a deep wound in Iraq's abdomen before retreating, thinking that with his broken sword, he wouldn't be able to land a fatal blow. The moment he landed, the Spider Queen had already raised her leg to attack, but she was intercepted by a sword that suddenly appeared, blocking her strike and protecting Taehyun. Junseo advanced while the guild leader focused on buying time to create a new weapon for him. When Junio finished creating the weapon, he suddenly felt something strange and shuddered. Looking at his palm, he wondered if he had exhausted all his mana. Reflecting that it was already incredible that he had lasted this long, he pulled a potion bottle from his pocket. After drinking it, he thought about how the potion could only be used once per day since excessive use would cause dependency. He tossed the bottle aside and, feeling a surge of energy, commented with a smile that the effect was excellent. Meanwhile, Juno was deeply concerned. In an instant, a sword appeared in front of him. The creator of the sword told him to buy time. After that, he thought about how the erection was a B-rank boss. If not for the error, there should have only been a C-rank boss called the Spider Queen. Thankfully, Taehyun was there because dealing with this monster would have been difficult for them. Not only did the danger level exceed that of a B rank, but the level itself was shifting at that moment. The new Spider Queen swung her leg. Striking at her opponent, she immediately blocked it by swinging his blade. She then began launching rapid attacks with a smile, which he swiftly countered. Watching them, Juno thought that their raw combat power surpassed that of 5 A-rank fighters. As for Iraq's ability, it wasn't possible to rely solely on Taehyun. He told the rest of the group to get up because they needed to be ready to fight. Erichin had changed her target. The group leader exclaimed nervously, "Who is he?" The others stood up and asked why such a talented awakened one was secretly disguised as an assistant. He turned to them and, pointing at the small spiders rushing toward them, said they had something to deal with first. He waved his hand, creating a weapon, and told them to choose. They could either take the weapon in front of them and clear the dungeon by fighting the spiders, or they could run and wait outside until everything was over. Extending his hand toward them, he said he was sure they would make the right choice. After that, the group members picked up their new weapons and joined the battle. The swordsman swung his blade, slicing through the spider's body with ease, thinking that this was incredible. He had never wielded a weapon like that before. He swung the sword a few more times, preventing the spiders from attacking. As he looked at the clean cuts on their bodies, he thought it felt like cutting through paper. Was it really that easy to kill monsters? Suddenly, a loud crackling sound distracted him from the battle. The mage had used magic, and her staff began emitting electric sparks. She was so fascinated by the sight that she smiled broadly. Then, she confidently swung her staff, bringing down lightning upon the spiders. The team leader was utterly shocked. He had thought only the weapon had changed, but the power of their abilities had increased several times over. Did he really create such a good weapon? After the girl's strike, only charred corpses remained on the ground. The team leader turned his gaze back to Juno and exclaimed in his thoughts, "Who is he?" Meanwhile, Taehyun's sword was still intact. He paused after a series of strikes and clenched his teeth. This was to be expected from a B-rank boss. It was difficult to buy time. His opponent grinned widely and then let out a loud scream, leaning toward him. Her body was already covered in multiple cuts from his attacks, igniting his sword with flames once more. He thought that he needed to finish this as quickly as possible. Erichin, seeing the light emitted by his blade, froze for a moment. After that, Taehyun lunged forward to attack, But she wasn't going down so easily. She swung her arm. He was faster and delivered a powerful fiery strike, making her collapse instantly. Afterward, he looked at his blade. It was still intact, better than he had imagined. Suddenly, he noticed several small spiders on the ground moving toward the girl. Looking around in alarm, she exclaimed, "Where did they come from? And where are they going?" The group leader shouted that they were all heading toward the guild master. Taeyeon turned to them and ordered, "Fall back." After that, he thought to himself, did she hide the spiders? The situation was dire. She activated her ability. The spiders completely covered the wound on Erichin's body. Taeyeon stated she sacrificed the spiders to restore her health. After that, all of Erichin's head wounds were healed. She looked at her opponent. Then she pushed herself up with her hands, helping herself to stand. Once again, she rose over the man, looking at the queen spider and the 1,000 small subjects behind her. He said that until they were all dead, she would continue regenerating repeatedly. He activated his ability and rushed in to attack, thinking that he needed to increase his firepower to end everything in one go. Suddenly, his blade broke, and upon realizing this, he cursed loudly. At the same time, the protagonist smiled and said, "You're better than I imagined." He extended his hand forward, creating a weapon once again, and added, "Although I've created a sword with the remaining mana, I didn't think it would be destroyed." After that, a massive sword was embedded into the ground near Taehan's feet. The protagonist told him to take it. "It isn't a one-handed sword like the ones you've used before," he explained. "It's the strongest weapon I can create at the moment." Without saying a word, Taehan placed his hand on the hilt. As soon as he grabbed the sword, he felt that with this weapon, he could defeat them all in one strike. The blade in his hand immediately ignited in flames, and fiery cracks began to spread from the tip along the ground. He smiled and said, "I'm not very familiar with two-handed swords, but it seems to suit me well." After that, he pulled the sword from the ground, using all his strength to hold it. He gritted his teeth and charged forward. As soon as he was close enough, he swung the sword and unleashed a powerful fire strike. Erichin grew nervous, clenched her teeth, and her face was illuminated by a burst of flame. The flame passed through her body, followed by a deafening explosion. Hiro thought that the explosion was a basic berserker ability. This was probably the first time Taehan had fully used it. A berserker loses control of themselves in exchange for gaining overwhelming power. You probably hadn't used it before because it was difficult to manage the risk of the weapon shattering. Meanwhile, Taehan lowered his sword and stood still. Then flames began to escape from his mouth, followed by a powerful burst of energy that released all the fire. Afterward, the flames gradually subsided, and he sighed, thinking that had been dangerous. If he couldn't release all his power, he would lose his sanity. He looked at his trembling hand and thought that this was only the second time this had happened since his awakening. Finally, he had managed to use this ability properly. Then he looked at Juno, thinking that he had been wrong. Juno wasn't just an ordinary awakened. Once his ability was discovered, the entire world would focus on him. This thought unsettled him, and he decided to take another look at Erichin's shattered body. The protagonist approached and examined it closely, noticing a purple aura. There was an incredible amount of mana radiating from it. It wasn't even comparable to other dungeon bosses with a bug. He turned to Taehan. "Do you feel anything coming from that corpse?" Taehan responded, "No, she's definitely dead. We got rid of her remains. She's no longer alive." At that moment, the protagonist realized that not even a high-ranking hunter could sense this mana. So he stepped closer. As he did, his passive ability activated. The aura began to flow into his body. His magic bar was completely filled, and the system notified him that 150 mana units were accumulated, out of a total of 100. If the collected magic exceeded the limit, a reward would be granted. He obtained a new ability, demonic weapon production. This was an active skill that consumed 100 units of accumulated mana to create weapons from the demonic realm. At the moment, he had no demonic weapons stored. They would be stored once created and could be materialized without using additional mana. He could use this ability once per day and thought that he couldn't even imagine what a demonic realm weapon would be, although he had no memories of the demonic realm. Could it be what he was thinking? It was a pity that the reward wasn't related to mana, but this wasn't bad at all. His magic bar was reset to 50 units, and he thought that, thanks to Araction, he had already obtained half of the required amount. It seemed the reward ended there. Suddenly, Taeyeon interrupted his thoughts, called out to him, and said that he had something to tell him. The protagonist turned to him and asked, "What's wrong?" Taeyeon replied, "I want to apologize." He bowed to him and said, "Despite your refusal, I still insisted that you join the guild. It was rude of me, even as the guild leader." Jonio, clearly not expecting this, was slightly surprised. The man closed his eyes and said, "I truly regret it and want to apologize." The protagonist felt uncomfortable and asked, "What are you suddenly doing?" At that moment, the team leader looked in their direction and nervously wondered, What am I seeing right now? Tan, bowing to a dank assistant, thought from what his abilities indicate he is clearly not an ordinary person. He must be a hidden talent from the Overkill Guild. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by the swordsman's voice, making him flinch and immediately turn around. The man waved his hand with a smile. It's dangerous, he said. They had searched everywhere, and there was nothing left there. The girl walking beside him shared his thoughts. Arashin must have absorbed all the monsters in the dungeon beforehand, she said. The man looked at his disappearing sword and asked, Isn't this an incredible weapon? They can cut through monsters without wasting any energy. She agreed with his words. I never heard of a pawnsmith capable of doing something like that, she said. Is he from the Overkill Guild? Suddenly, the team leader ran up to them and wrapped his arms around them, nervously urging them to leave so he could contact the association. The man looked worried and asked in confusion, Why exactly do we have to leave already? The girl agreed with him. I want to thank both the guild master and the assistant first, she said. The excited leader waved his hands. Quickly leave this disgusting place, he urged. At that, the swordsman looked confused and replied, We already understand. You should stop insisting. After that, the team leader led them to the exit. Glancing at the rest of the team, the protagonist thought that despite the obvious connection between this assistant and the Overkill Guild, it was best for them to leave. If they interfered with the affairs of a major guild, there would be no end to the trouble. Whatever the emergency was, releasing such power so easily was not typical of large guilds that prioritize security. Juno stepped aside and agreed to talk. Although I've used the rental contract, the guild leader shouldn't bow to someone he barely knows, he said. Kayan nodded. The guild will no longer trouble you, and of course, neither will I. But that statement didn't mean they had given up. This was their first chance. The protagonist crossed his arms over his chest, looking at him with suspicion. Then he extended his hand, offering to make a contract. I'm sure you'll like the terms, he said. A new day arrived, and the protagonist went to the Overkill Guild building. There, he found Hizu at the reception. She smiled when she saw him. I'm happy to see you again, she said, introducing herself. Today, I'll be responsible for handling the contract. Juno thanked her and mentioned the guild leader had said he'd contact me immediately, but who would have thought it would be the very next morning? Hizu replied, The leader asked to prepare everything as quickly as possible. He nodded, asking, So, where are we now that we've arrived? She responded that this was Overkill's special reception room, a highly secure place, so he didn't need to worry about privacy. Then she placed the contract on the table and asked him to read it. These were the conditions the guild leader had mentioned in the dungeon. It would take some time, but he could modify the contract's content, so he shouldn't hesitate to say what he thought. The protagonist picked up the contract and read it carefully. He felt with a smile, just as he had said in the dungeon. Now that everything was settled, it felt more real. He placed the contract back on the table and said, I have no questions. We can proceed. While discussing the contract terms in the dungeon, Junseo had been confused about the guild supporting him. Tanyan clarified that it wasn't official support, but secret support. Of course, this was just speculation, but he vaguely understood why Taehyun didn't want him to join the guild. For several reasons, he needed to hide his identity. If he was right, then his suggestion might help. They could secretly supply the materials he needed, equipment, ingredients, gape rights. It didn't matter. He only needed to sign a contract as a formality. Everything would be provided in secret. Of course, the protagonist asked, Why are you suddenly being so generous? He replied, Naturally, it's not just out of kindness. I'll need to complete missions personally assigned to me. These are my conditions, but I won't force you. If you don't like the missions, you can refuse. Juhyo laughed and asked, What would happen if I didn't help, but still received your support? He replied, That would be fine as well. The main point of the contract is to create a bond between the guild and you, preventing you from joining others. Accepting the support is nothing more than a sign of your loyalty. That's all. Suddenly, strong footsteps were heard nearby. They turned toward the sound. The association members ran up to them, identifying themselves as members of the Hunter Association team. One of them clicked his tongue at the guild master and asked, Are you okay? Realizing it was time to leave, Taehyun turned and told Junseo, You'll hear my answer outside. I hope it's yes. If I've overwhelmed you too much, then don't respond. Finally, he turned around and with a smile added, To me, your ability is the best. Reflecting on this, the protagonist picked up a pen and thought, according to my plan. He wanted to leave a lasting impression on Taehyun and continue his relationship with the Overkill Guild without officially joining it. But for now, this would still be useful to him. So he signed his name and handed the document to Hizu, asking when he would start receiving support. She replied, From now on, just let me know if you need anything. She took a small box from her bag and placed it on the table. The guild master prepared a gift for you as a memento of the contract. I heard you found something useful in Ericsson's room. Juno was curious. He opened the box, but a strange substance began to seep out. He quickly closed it, put it in his backpack, and smiled. "Thank you." He handed her a list of the materials he currently needed and asked, "When can I receive them?" She looked over the list and replied, "There are a lot of items here. I think it should be possible within a week." However, she hesitated, feeling like she might be meddling in something that wasn't her business. "I have to admit, though, I would think these materials will be useful to you." Juno got up from the couch, slung his backpack over his shoulders, and replied, "I won't use them. I just want to give them to someone else." Time passed, and he went to the Hunter Association to meet someone. He pulled out his phone and checked the time. Thinking that she should have arrived by now, he smiled when a timid girl entered the association. He assumed it was the A-rank hunter, Han Jia, finally showing up. The girl hesitantly walked toward the counter. In his future memories, she had a completely different personality. When she fought against monsters and shot arrows, creating huge holes in their bodies, she was confident and strong. After the players were selected, this genius hunter had earned the title Archer Goddess. But now, without lifting her gaze from the ground, she approached the counter and turned to the association's attendant. She spoke softly, requesting a training pass for the gate. Handing over her ID, she smiled and asked, "Since I'm an A-rank hunter, shouldn't I be eligible for a C-rank gate?" The attendant was surprised. She refused with a shy smile, adding, "Actually, I'd like to obtain a pass for the D-rank gate." The attendant stared at her information on the computer. She had entered the gate only twice. He assumed she had recently been classified as an A-rank hunter, but even considering that, her lack of experience surprised him. He had seen lower-ranked awakeners give up on everything before, but not a rank one. He quickly glanced at Han Jia, who was filling out the documents, and thought she probably had her reasons. However, she would soon be demoted. The first rank of the Awakened is based on the amount of mana. When the blue energy poured through the rifts, mana entered all human beings, but each absorbed a different amount. The more the body could store, the better a person's abilities were. So the association started calculating how much mana each person had. Those who could control more than a certain amount were called Awakened. Then they began ranking them depending on the amount of mana. Of course, the rank is not fixed. Even if the rank is low, a hunter can carry out dungeon raids. If they gain fame within the association, they can be promoted. Of course, the opposite also happens. At that moment, Han Jina handed the documents to the girl with a smile and said, "I've filled out everything. Would you like help with the registration? Do you have a partner?" The girl excitedly replied, "No. Then I'll register you on the partner list. According to the rules, incursions must be carried out in pairs." So far, there had been no requests for the demotion gate, so she would have to wait a little. She asked if she could go alone. Hanji replied, "You can, but only if you have permission to enter alone." However, considering that she was registering, she did not have that permission. To obtain it, she needed to pass the test. "Do you want to sign up for it?" Hanji got nervous and asked her to wait. The girl then said, "I need to tell you something. In a month, I'll have a rank update." Hanji froze in place at those words about to leave. The girl continued, "You've probably seen the message, but to confirm your rank A, you'll need experience clearing a rank C dungeon or higher or past a ranking test." Hanjia thought the test would be more suitable for her. "I'll probably receive a message about it soon," the girl added. "I hope to succeed." Hanjia thanked her excitedly and then left the association. It was difficult even to request a training gate, so she would need to make an online request. Coming to such a crowded place was madness. She decided to come because she thought she wouldn't be demoted. She composed herself, remembering her experience clearing the dungeon. It had been a ranked E gate, so something like that wouldn't happen again. If she didn't rush, everything would be fine. Suddenly, a message arrived on her phone, and she nervously adjusted her glasses. She thought that they had said she would have to wait for an invitation, but it had already arrived. As expected, rank D. She was going alone anyway, so it didn't matter. She needed to accept quickly. A new day arrived, and she approached the rank D gate. She walked hesitantly toward the portal, thinking that she hadn't dressed like this in a long time. It felt so unusual for her. The protagonist, who had become her partner, approached and asked for her name. Then he introduced himself, saying he hoped they would get along well. Hanji had made a slight bow and said, "It's a pleasure to meet you." He smiled timidly, apologizing for being late. "We need to go quickly," he added. She agreed excitedly, saying that she had made a request and then spoke with the association staff. At that moment, he thought that she was a ranger-ass hunter who had originally been ranked A, but after continuously failing the tests, she had been demoted to rank C. Even under such conditions, she had earned the title of Archer Goddess because after becoming a player, she had discovered a hidden talent within herself. And he knew what kind of talent that was. It was a talent that could be discovered within oneself, even without being a player. Today, he wanted to awaken it in her. After that, they entered the dungeon and found themselves in a forest in the middle of the mountains, where goblins were roaming freely. A small group of goblins was patrolling the area. Hanjia, who was hiding behind the bushes, peeked discreetly and thought, are they gone? Are they really monsters? Good thing she decided to buy this. She looked at the bracelet and thought it was equipment that detected the mana of monsters. She turned to her partner and apologized, saying she would go alone. "I do the killing alone?" she asked. "I promise to give you all the loot and compensate you for everything." He crouched in response and told her not to worry. "If you need help, let me know," he said. "At the very least, I can create arrows for you." She stood up, thanked him, pulled an arrow onto the bowstring, and aimed. Mentally, she told herself that everything was fine. She didn't need to worry. Finding the right moment, she released the arrow. It left a magical glow as it passed, then approached the goblin. When it turned, the arrow struck its head. The second goblin quickly moved out of the attack line and grabbed its bow to shoot back. Behind them, there was an explosion caused by the arrow colliding with something. Pulling the bowstring again, Hanjia released another arrow, but missed. Judio, on the other hand, watched her and thought that he had never seen her fight before she became a player. Her raw destructive power was much greater than that of a Ranka, but it was useless if she couldn't aim. At that moment, Hanjia fired another arrow and made a hole in one of the monster's bodies. Then, she thought that one of the 3 arrows had hit the target. That was her record. This way, she could kill at least 4 more monsters. She needed to finish everything with 2 shots. Just as she was about to shoot another arrow, she suddenly stopped. She noticed that one of the goblins was blowing a horn, alerting the others to the danger. She didn't immediately understand what that meant, but then goblins appeared in the clearing. Feeling the pressure from all sides, she froze in place. Her bracelet beeped, warning of danger. As she looked around, she realized she was surrounded. Confused and nervous, she thought, where should I shoot, forward or backward? What should I do? At that moment, the goblins behind her decided to attack. But suddenly, an intense glow appeared in front of her. Many swords embedded themselves in the ground, stopping them from advancing. Junio walked toward Hanjia, smiling. "I need your help," he said. She exclaimed in surprise. "Didn't you say you were a D-rank creator?" "I did," he replied, his sword beginning to dissolve, "but it won't last long. I need your help." She turned to him. "What should I do?" He pointed his finger at the monsters hiding behind the bushes. "Shoot there with all your remaining strength." She nodded, aiming again. She didn't know what he was planning, but she would do as he asked. With that, she fired an arrow that flew at lightning speed, destroying everything in its path. She warned him, "Watch out for the shot." "What should I do next?" He grabbed her hand. "With that shot, you've cleared the way. Now you need to run." At that moment, the monsters rushed toward them, and she was very surprised to see him running from them while pulling her along. Soon, they distanced themselves from the monsters and found themselves at the entrance of a cave. Hanjia caught her breath and wiped the sweat from her face. "We survived," she said. Then she thought, where were they? She wondered if they had gotten rid of the goblins. She remembered that while they were running through the forest, she had looked back and had the feeling that they wouldn't be able to catch up with them anymore. Was there really something back there? So much had happened that she couldn't even understand. She looked at her partner, who was lighting up the cave with a lantern, and mentally thought, why is he still calm? They needed to get out of here quickly. She smiled shyly and said that she was done for the day, that she would pay the compensation he had mentioned. He replied that they couldn't leave yet. They were concerned, so they would stay there for a while. It was too dangerous to leave now. It seemed they had left a trail while running, so they had no choice but to wait for the goblins to move away. She exclaimed, when could they leave then? He turned to her and replied that it'd take half a day, but depending on the situation, it might take longer. Hearing this, he shuddered, then clutched her head, exclaiming, half a day? Deciding they were doomed, she knelt in despair. He scratched the back of his head, thinking that, of course, he was lying. They would be far away in about 30 minutes, and the goblin's focus wasn't that strong. It was a pathetic reason. But at this point, it seemed like Hando would believe anything. He looked again at the cave entrance and thought that this was because he needed to force her to enter the cave with him. As he pondered this, he closed his eyes and crossed his arms over his chest. Then he imagined her running out of the cave in panic and thought he doubted she would agree. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by Hania's guilty voice. She stood up, bowed, and apologized. All of this was my fault, she said. If I knew how to fight, if I had gone alone from the beginning, none of this would have happened. She felt terrible about all of it. Nervously, she gripped her weapon in her hands and thought that once again she had caused problems. Even in a D-rank dungeon, she was acting like this. She was desperate. She shouldn't have even tried. She started crying and gritted her teeth, telling herself she shouldn't have come here. Juno extended his hand to her and snapped his fingers in front of her face. Distracting her from those thoughts, he said, if you feel guilty, then I'll let you do something for me. You need to pull yourself together. She hesitated and asked, what's the request? He turned toward the cave and said, we have plenty of time. Then he looked at her with a smile and added, I'll explain everything in detail. After that, they entered the cave together and began moving forward, lighting the path with the lantern. Hanjia hesitated and asked, "Do you really need my help?" She was an A rank, but she didn't have much experience in dungeons and didn't even understand what he meant by an elite monster. He smiled, remembering that she had said this was her first time in a training gate. "Now I understand why you don't know," he said. "It's not very common knowledge. Instead of bosses in this dungeon, there was a lower ranked elite monster. It lived in that cave. For personal reasons, he needed to defeat it. But so far, he had been rejected and hadn't even been able to fight it. That's why she was the first to accept him as support for her team." Upon hearing this, she shrank back and remained silent. He glanced at her, wondering if that had sounded strange. Gathering her determination, she pressed her lips together. Then she stopped and confidently said, "I'll help you, if you don't mind." Remembering the goblins in the forest, she thought that helping him was the right decision. Thanks to him, she had been saved, and she also knew how painful it was not to be accepted into a team. She needed to help him. Suddenly, her bracelet beeped. At that moment, a loud sound of footsteps echoed through the area. She became nervous. The protagonist lit up the space in front of them. A huge goblin with a club in its hand appeared before them. It was the elite monster. Hanjia immediately stepped forward and pulled back her bowstring. "Judio, move away," she called out, then thought to herself. Even though the monster was in the light, it was still a ranked T monster. If she hit it at least once, it would die. Her arrow became wrapped in magical chains, and then she released it. Seeing that it was following the correct trajectory, she rejoiced in her success. But suddenly, the goblin covered itself with the club. The arrow went through it, leaving Hanjia stunned. With the impact, the goblin's leg slid backward. She thought, did it deflect the arrow? She was wrong. She needed to shoot with all her strength. She pulled back the string again, but when she tried to release it, her body did respond. Her fingers refused to let go of the arrow's tip. Her hands trembled. Why now? She thought nervously. I need to shoot. Hearing the loud sound again, she shifted her attention to the monster, seeing it running toward them. While swinging its club, she froze in fear. Suddenly, the protagonist grabbed her and threw her back, causing her to fall. He then stepped forward. Right after that, a loud noise was heard and dust rose. The monster had slammed its club into the ground with full force. Looking at the dust cloud in confusion, she called out to Juno. She remembered being in the dungeon and found herself in a similar situation. A girl from her team exclaimed, "What is she doing? Is this all a joke to her? She can't even shoot properly. And when she did, it was in her direction. She almost died because of her. How is she going to make up for it?" Hanjia asked her to wait and said that although she had missed the target, she didn't intend to shoot at her. The girl gave a sarcastic smile and asked angrily, "She's not apologizing, but making excuses. Does she think that just because she's rank A, the whole world is at her feet? She'll soon find out who she's messing with." After they left the dungeon and Hanjia went to the association, she was rejected from the team. Other hunters began whispering, asking if she was the rank a loser. They had heard that she almost killed someone in the dungeon and that she couldn't even kill a weak monster. Someone called her an idiot and said that's why even ranked D teams rejected her. Another hunter asked what she was doing with her talent. What a waste. If she was like this, why was she still a hunter? Coming out of her memories, she looked at the monster with a dark expression. She thought that she should have given up on everything. Because of her, even Janu got hurt. At that exact moment, the goblin raised its club above its head, ready to strike. But suddenly, a bright spark flew between them. Jansa said, "You really are bad at acting." His sword easily blocked the elite monster's attack, and Jia, realizing this, called out to him in surprise. He loudly said, "I know it sounds meaningless, but you need to listen carefully. If you calm down and just do as I say, then we'll definitely win." He frowned, thinking that he had prepared everything. In emergency, she would be able to activate it without problems. All that was left was to buy time. He continued swinging his sword, attacking, and told her to look carefully at that idiot. She would see something and should hit that mark with all her power. But Hanjio was no longer listening to him. Her body trembled, and she started to get up. Wondering what that feeling was, her senses felt sharper. It was very uncomfortable, but she could see everything. Her eyes gleamed as she pulled back the arrow again, thinking that now she could clearly see where to aim. She drew the arrow and fully focused, closing her eyes. Then she opened them wide and thought that with this single arrow, everything would be resolved. She aimed and released the arrow, which left a brilliant light in the air. The goblin froze in place, hearing the whistling sound and admitted. "Fortunately, it seems everything activated correctly," the protagonist declared. "But for some reason, the activation conditions are very strict." Then the elite monster extended its club toward the arrow to shield itself from the strike, but the arrow pierced through both the weapon and the monster, leaving a large hole in its body. Seeing this, Juna smiled, thinking it had been worth it, while Hanjio was both surprised and confused at the same time. Right after that, an explosion occurred. The severed limb of the monster fell to the ground from the impact, and the creature itself began to lose balance before eventually collapsing. Hangyu was still panting as the protagonist explained that it would feel strange at first. However, he stated that she had probably never felt her senses being amplified before. Still, he had resorted to some extreme methods to make her understand that sensation, so she could realize her potential. Even so, Hangyu was still confused and asked, "How did you know all of that would happen? What do you mean by my potential?" He smiled and told her to take her time. "We have plenty of it." She walked up to him and in an irritated tone said, "Don't change the subject. Answer the question." But before she could finish speaking, she suddenly felt a sharp pain grip her head and then lost consciousness. The protagonist had to carry her on his back all the way to the exit, sighing heavily. "Making friends is really difficult," he muttered. "But at least one thing is resolved, right?" When they exited the cave, she woke up. The first thing she did was apologize to him, saying, "I don't know if I acted that way. I feel like I wasn't myself." She couldn't believe she had shown such disrespect to the man who had saved her twice. She was truly sorry for doubting him and for fainting so suddenly. He was confused by her apology, then touched his forehead, feeling the exhaustion inside. He reassured her that everything was fine, no one was hurt, and they had defeated all the monsters, so she should calm herself. Half an hour had already passed. She nodded, tears still in her eyes. He then asked if she could return the pendant he had given her earlier, before they entered the cave. Remembering, she reached into her pocket and handed it to him. He examined the pendant carefully and noticed that the crystal's color had changed. It had definitely been activated. The meteor perception pendant was a rare item, obtainable only in the A-rank dungeon known as Burning Harpy's Nest. This artifact carried a unique ability called Keen Senses, which automatically activated once certain conditions were met. For instance, if an arrow was shot toward the wearer, their senses would sharpen drastically, heightening their perception to an almost superhuman level. He returned the pendant to her, realizing that the difficulty lay in the strict activation requirements. The wearer's emotions needed to reach their peak. For someone like Hangyu, the most natural way for it to awaken was when she experienced overwhelming fear in the midst of danger. Through this, he had managed to help her unlock the pendant's hidden power. Even at such a high price, there were very few of these pendants on the market, and he had already given up on getting one. But he figured that Tahan would find the item in 2 days. Thanks to him, everything had become much easier, but this was only the beginning. Hangyu only felt like she was awakening because of the item. She would need more practice to reach her original level. His expression grew serious, and he told her to listen carefully. Her first task was to ensure that her concentration was entirely focused on the monsters. To do that, she first needed to change her bow. She was strong enough to switch from a short bow to a long bow and shoot from a distance. Naturally, she wouldn't need to fight monsters up close, which would make her less afraid of them. He wanted to tell her something else, but she didn't let him finish. She simply thanked him. He didn't understand why she was thanking him, and she said she was grateful for everything, including the pendant. "When I thought I was going to die there," she said, "I felt something coming from you as if everything around me had frozen. It was like I could do anything." She saw where she was aiming, and the target was perfectly aligned with the monster. To be honest, even though she had a rank in terms of character and everything else, she was no more than a D rank, and the more she tried to change that, the more disappointed she became. But she had the feeling that during this short period of time together, she had grown a lot. She felt capable, like she could do anything. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe it. Realizing she had said too much, she became worried, but he smiled and said it wouldn't be easy for her alone. He would give her his number so she could call if she needed anything. She was very happy and thanked him. Then she said she would also leave her number. When Judy was about to give his number, he noticed a message from Tahan asking him to call quickly because there was an emergency. He decided he would contact him once they left the dungeon. After some time, as soon as he and Haniat exited the dungeon, he called Tahan. "Thank you," Tahan said. "I'll call back after the meeting." Judu smiled. "I'll help if I can." Last time, Tahan had given him something very useful. Tahan replied, "I'm glad it helped you. I'm happy you agreed to help me." After that, he hung up the phone, put it in his pocket, and was looking out the window when he heard a knock on the door. Hizu entered the office. "The association president has returned. We can leave now." Shortly after, the two arrived at the association building and walked down the hallway. But Hizu was restless. "This situation is very unusual," she commented. "Normally, he would send an official document. Who would have imagined that the association president would summon you? He's been sending difficult orders through documents, but if he called you personally, maybe the rank as gate has appeared again." Tan replied, "It's fine. Janu agreed to help me. If he fights like last time, there won't be any danger." He thought with a satisfied smile that he was right to establish a working relationship with Janu. He, on the other hand, was worried. Thinking that he seemed more excited than after the Erichin dungeon, probably all because of that creator, he had been acting strangely ever since. Unlimited support. Who would have thought the guildmaster would make such a surprising offer? She knew that berserkers had difficulty controlling their emotions, but the guildmaster was calculated and sensible. Could Juna be more capable than she had imagined? But she immediately dismissed that idea, thinking that a D rank couldn't create a weapon he truly liked. He rarely invited him, so she needed to find out everything in person. Taehan noticed her suspicious look, and then the two arrived at the office door of the president. The guard outside greeted them, asking if he was alone. Taehan was slightly surprised by the question and asked if someone else was supposed to come. The guard responded that from what he had heard, 2 guild leaders were expected. If they were alone, he could wait. Taehan asked if he could find out who the other leader was. The man noticed someone behind them, then pointed ahead with a smile, saying that he had arrived. The leader of the Shima Guild appeared behind them. Upon noticing Taehan, he exclaimed in surprise, hearing his voice. Taehan and his secretary immediately turned. Ayak waved at him and said, "I heard you've been very busy lately." Taehan remained silent while Heizu frowned, thinking that Ayak was the only person who irritated the guild leader. Hyo gave a fake smile and said, "I didn't expect to see you here." Taehan frowned slightly, holding back his anger. The Shima Guild master approached and asked, "Who is this? Isn't this the Idea Guild leader?" Taehan remained silent, thinking about how irritating Ayak was. He mocked him, "You're wrong. It's not the guild that's the problem. It's the leader." Taehan sighed and said, "I'm too busy to respond to your absurd provocations." Ayak smirked, "Must be busy choosing low-level dungeons. Are you comforting yourself by making the rookies admire you?" Eve didn't like that and asked, "What are you trying to say?" Ayak stated, "It seems true, since you haven't gone to those dungeons to save anyone. After all, you tried to clear a ranked dungeon and got misclassified." Yu was surprised, and Taehan placed a hand on her shoulder, telling her, "Don't respond to that." She wanted to eject, but he didn't. He turned to the guard and said they would go in. Then he opened the doors and told the association president that the leaders of the Overkill and Shinua guilds were already there. Jilman replied that he already knew. He could hear their argument from there. He smiled and added that they never changed. Soon after, both entered and Heizu remained outside. The guard looked at the girl sitting next to him a bit hesitantly and offered her tea, but she politely declined, saying she was fine. Meanwhile, the 2 guild leaders, Taehan and Aok, were seated in front of Shminhan. He looked at them and said there was an urgent task for their guild that needed to be completed immediately. 3 days ago, an unspecified gate appeared on the outskirts of the city. Scouts were sent to investigate it, but none of them returned. Tan frowned and asked if this gate was an error gate. Gilman replied that, as he had already mentioned, the gate was undefined and even measuring its mana was extremely difficult. Ayak exclaimed in confusion, trying to grasp the situation. Tan thought it was strange that the gate couldn't even be evaluated since tools for that purpose normally existed. The rank of a gate was usually determined by 2 factors. First, the amount of mana inside the gate was measured using a special tool, which allowed for determining the gate's rank. Usually, the gate's rank corresponded to the rank of the monsters inside. Second, the intelligence data sent by the association to assess the situation was compared. Jilman stated that, as they already knew, rank error dungeons emerged when the amount of mana inside suddenly increased. However, this time it was impossible to measure. Tan asked if they had tried sending more scouts. He confirmed that they had done so multiple times, but none of the scouts returned. I placed my hands behind my head in frustration and asked irritably if they had no information about the dungeon's rank or what it contained. He suspiciously questioned whether the association was trying to shift the blame for what had happened. The president of the association responded, explaining that they didn't know how long the veil of the unknown rank gate would last. If they didn't act soon, it was very likely that monsters would start emerging from the gate. He reminded them that this had happened in the past, and every time it did, it turned into a complete disaster. Then, with a serious expression, he added that he understood how his words might seem pushy. But this was truly an emergency, and this time no refusals would be accepted. He wanted the Overkill and Shinua guilds to join forces to clear the undefined gate. He would have liked to send the Heiyaman guild as well, but they couldn't participate due to a sudden mission abroad. This case was serious enough to gather the 3 largest guilds. He set a 2-day deadline for preparation, stating that he would provide funding and the best possible reward for completing the mission. Of course, if they needed anything, he would assist them in any way possible. Reflecting on what he had said, Taehan asked, should the cleanup team consist only of guild members? John Ham replied, "It doesn't matter. The existence of this gate is causing chaos and panic in society. We can only allow a small number of trustworthy individuals to participate in the mission." Seeing Tahan's reaction, Yayak looked at him with a slightly surprised expression. Tahan then smiled faintly, his confidence evident, and said, "I understand everything." After that, Yayak returned to his guild. Tossing his jacket to a subordinate, he ordered, "Gather a team of A rank or higher guild members and select those who will be available in the next 2 days. Recalling Tahan's smile, he thought that the man must be hiding some kind of scheme. That smile was so unsettling, and he felt certain Tahan would use this opportunity to get ahead. Feeling annoyed, he gave the order that Yurin Kang must be included in the team, which greatly surprised his subordinates. He emphasized that she had to be invited without fail. The team members grew uneasy at the command since Yurin was well known for rarely offering help to anyone. One girl in the group, speaking with a hint of excitement, remarked that Yurin's personality meant she would almost certainly refuse. Aak immediately responded firmly, "No matter what, we need to make sure she joins." Then he warned in a stern tone if he doesn't be ready to switch roles. The guild members, intimidated by his words, quickly acknowledged the order and hurried off to carry it out. Still unsettled, Aak stepped into the elevator, thinking that although Yurin usually refused to help others, this time he intended to take advantage of the situation to recruit her. 2 days later, the first group, composed of Overkill Guild members, gathered at the gate. A girl named Junseo Shin asked what time it was, since the others had not yet arrived. A man with glasses replied, "There are 5 minutes left until the scheduled meeting time." They were always punctual, clearly expressing her distaste. She spun her weapon in her hand and said, "I can't stand those pompous idiots. They have no manners." Her expression hardened, and she asked, "Would they learn anything if I shot them in the head?" The man, outraged by her words, smacked her on the head. "Be careful with what you say," he told her. She clutched her head in pain and responded, "You're brutally strong." He stepped toward her in a threatening manner. "What did you just say?" he asked. After that, she started running, and he chased after her. Junio, observing the scene, commented to Tahan, "Your guild members get along very well." Tahan replied, "It may seem that way, but they're very reliable in battle. I'm grateful Junseo accepted." He paused, then added, "Honestly, I thought he would refuse." The protagonist smiled slightly. "I used the item you gave me," he said, his pride evident. He turned his attention to the guild members, who had already started fighting. Of course, that wasn't the only reason. He had a secret mission that would take place in a dungeon with a story. In there, he needed to put an end to the abandoned world and receive rewards. The dungeon's opening time was 168 hours. Additionally, the mission window had unknown coordinates and rewards written on it. 5 days ago, this system window, featuring a secret mission, something only a small number of players had received, had suddenly appeared before him. The selection of players had not yet begun, but he had already received the secret mission. He saw no reason to refuse. Although these missions had very high difficulty levels, if he completed them, he could receive incredible rewards. Some even had the potential to awaken new abilities. Who would have thought it would be the same dungeon? Suddenly, Tahan distracted him from his thoughts. Shots rang out, and he looked at him, meeting his serious gaze. "I apologize in advance for that idiot's rudeness," Tahan said. Then, Ai's voice was heard nearby, saying that they were a little early. The vice leader and Jui immediately stopped fighting. Tahan stepped forward, while Aok apologized to them, saying they had a lot of work. They understood that, but it seemed like the Overkill Guild had too much free time. Arriving at the meeting location with his team, he said with a sarcastic smile, "We've been clearing low-rank gates." Because of that, Zhu became really irritated, but the man stopped her from moving, asked her not to respond and to ignore them. She wanted to object and was about to insult them, but he immediately silenced her and asked again to ignore them. At that moment, Junu stood at a distance, thinking that the Overkill and Shinwei guilds were still on bad terms. It wasn't just an emotional rivalry between the guilds, but also a public dispute over which one was stronger. Noticing a new face among Overkill's members, he looked closely at Junio and let out a laugh, asking if he was their trump card. Then he declared that they had acted as if they had something, but in the end, it was just him. His laughter turned into anger. He sighed heavily, saying that they had gone too far. Clearing the dungeon was a joke to them. Did they want to be carried out of there? The protagonist remained silent, and I called them idiots. A girl from his team smiled and asked him to stop getting angry, saying they also had a new member on their team. A girl named Kang Yurin appeared behind them, and with a displeased expression, she reminded them that they had said they were sure on time. She didn't think they had time to argue, so they needed to hurry. She took a step forward, and Juno, upon seeing her, recoiled in horror, wondering what kind of composition this was. The strongest elemental master in Korea, capable of using all 6 elements, Kang Yuran, an S-rank sorceress, Kim Ayak, and their guild leader, Yum Tahan. Did they really have such a star-studded team? She remained silent about Juno since she didn't know about his abilities. Then she sighed with a smile and said that it would be easy. She would be happy to handle all of this. After that, they headed toward the gate, and Junseo thought that it wouldn't be easy. In his previous life, the attempt to clear this dungeon had failed. Out of the 18 members, only Yum Tahan survived, mainly due to his infiltration ability. After that, the gates suddenly disappeared. It was an unprecedented case in which all high-ranking awakened ones were declared missing. The association worked tirelessly to find any information, but nothing about the dungeon was discovered. There was no guarantee that they would succeed this time, but after being in the dungeon for a while, everything turned out contrary to their expectations. Their opponents, the puppets, were so weak that the battle was incredibly easy for them. This made Jan so nervous, and he wondered why everything was so easy. Some time ago, a portal with a glowing ring had lit up at the grand entrance to the dungeon. Wow, this mansion is really cool, Jugwi commented. Be quiet, Maongan told her. The whole team was walking inside the dungeon when Mongan heard a strange sound coming from the portal. He turned around. There, he saw the gate closing forcefully. The others turned at the sound. He tried to open the doors, but nothing happened. Let's break them down, he suggested. The man shouted, I want to destroy the doors. Then they all started trying to break through the gate. He counted loudly, 1, 2, 3, and the others struck the gate forcefully. They were surprised. What's happening? They asked. The door didn't even budge. Unsatisfied, the man told everyone, step back. I'll do it myself now. However, he didn't have time to try. At that moment, strange sounds were heard behind him. He turned around. Several eerie dolls appeared. He attacked them, shouting, What are these creatures? With his strike, the dolls shattered into body parts. The rest of the team also began fighting the monsters. His attacks were especially powerful, and he questioned, How dare these creatures attack us when they're so weak? A girl called out to him, saying he could use his skill. However, he replied that he was fine. There was no need to use a skill for something so trivial. But soon after, the girls shouted for the leader to turn around because the monsters were reanimating behind him. The dolls began reassembling their bodies with the help of mana. He grinned maliciously, noting that their revival ability was kicking in. At the very least, this ability would be interesting to watch. So he threw a punch and 2 enormous manifests appeared beside him. The dolls continued their attack, but he began striking them fiercely, pummeling them with his magical fists that trapped them between blows. The rest of the team also fought the monsters using pistols. Jung Yin from G-Steen killed the dolls by slicing them apart with his spear. At that moment, only Junio and Urain remained on the sidelines. He asked if she wasn't going to fight. Urain asked the same question to Yuras. He explained that he was just a support. Urain stated that there was no need for her to fight. She didn't want to work hard for a team like this. She observed the powerful flames unleashed by Tahan. He swung his flaming sword, setting the dolls ablaze as they melted away. Yurin said she was interested in seeing Korea's strongest awakened in action. She wasn't impressed by the guild leader's fire and commented that everyone seemed ordinary. They couldn't even kill a single monster. If she had known this would happen, she would have refused the mission. At that moment, Juno looked at the dolls and their glowing threads. He thought it was strange. The contaminated mana and these monsters, they weren't in their usual form. He noticed that every movement of the dolls was accompanied by a movement of the threads. When he looked up at the ceiling, he saw the source of the threads. All the mana was connected to that artifact. All he had to do was destroy the item, but he didn't want to reveal his real abilities. Then he thought he could use the agreement, and everything would be fine. He didn't have time to act because he was distracted by Yurin, who killed a nearby insect using a magic crystal. The protagonist looked closely and asked if she had enough mana to use on insects. Why didn't you use it to attack the threads above? She pointed at the fly and asked, Haven't I already given the reason? The insect was incinerated in a swarm of lightning. Yurin responded that she killed whoever she wanted. Juno thought, while looking at the insect's ashes, that maybe there was no need to investigate further. He started creating something and said, maybe Urain was afraid of insects. After making that guess, he began forming something out of mana. She replied, I'm not afraid of things like that, and besides, you should stop talking to me. You're annoying me. Kansu apologized and said, I didn't mean to intrude, but there's also an insect up there. He created a shield with a spider beside him. Yurin said that's irritating and prepared to attack with fire. Junio immediately withdrew the shield, and she unleashed an enormous and powerful stream of fire onto the massive threads. A giant fireball destroyed everything, and Urain was confused. One of the dolls stopped moving, and at that moment, Aok struck another doll. Then he thought, why was that troublemaker Urain using her abilities there? But suddenly, he felt something strange and looked at the doll. He lifted it by the head and asked, what's happening? Why aren't they resurrecting anymore? In a moment, he squeezed the monster's head and said, I've finally warmed up, but in the end, weak monsters can't do anything. The wall was broken and glowed with intense mana. Junio walked toward it and began absorbing the mana. He realized that this was the source of the doll's resurrection. If he hadn't noticed the contaminated mana, he would never have found the origin. Thus, he assumed that this could have been the reason the dungeon cleanup had gone so wrong. Taya stood in front of a mountain of dolls, their bodies in pieces, and said that they were finished. but since they still didn't know everything, they needed to search the entire first floor. The man with glasses said he understood and asked everyone to follow him. He ran ahead and knocked down the door with his body, but Aok overtook him. He shouted for everyone to get out of the way because he would be the first. There were more dolls in the room, and Aok started punching them. The protagonist looked around the room and thought, is the contaminated mana gathering in that cabinet? He pointed to the cabinet and asked Jassi if she could shoot at it. She didn't understand at first, but then decided to follow his advice. When she shot, the weapon shattered into pieces. Everyone was shocked. Mine didn't understand what was happening or why everything was dying so suddenly, and G tried to distract him. Then they went through all the rooms and managed to finish the first floor quickly. Tan was the first to go up to the second floor and said that since they had cleared the first floor, they can proceed. Yaak, dissatisfied, said, I already know it's time for me to stop acting like the leader. Tan turned around and didn't respond, but led Mongan and Jawo forward. She smiled and spun the gun in her hand. It's a beautiful thing, she said, and Maeden looked at her enthusiastically. Hayak was furious at that moment. He thought Tan had decided to ignore him. How irritating. He wanted to crush his pride. Suddenly, he felt something unpleasant and looked at his palm. He didn't understand what was happening. Something hurt him for a second. Had he overdone it? However, he ordered his team to move forward. Heron said she would go with the leader, and there was a staircase with a strange incline. Junio was watching them, which worried him because, according to Tahan, there was nothing special there. He separated from the team and entered one of the rooms, deciding to check everything himself. It was dusty and dark. He covered his nose and soon saw many threads with an infected aura on the floor. He was surprised to see so much mana, but suddenly, a loud noise was heard. At that moment, Aok was fighting fiercely against the monsters. He shouted, I don't have time to use a skill. The other team members fought the monsters with the same bravery and fury. They shot and tried to cut the monsters into pieces, but nothing worked. Tan held his ground and deflected the monsters' blows with his sword. He asked, is everything okay? He realized they were being attacked by a highly invisible monster. Mayangan, he shouted. Are you okay? Yes, I'm fine, Mayangan replied. Ju was nearby and said, I'm fine too, but I can't see the guy who was with me. Tan asked her excitedly, where is he? He started searching the room. It was as if he could see different wind currents with the movement of each person. He began to worry because he hadn't noticed that Junio was missing. He started shouting and calling for him. At that moment, the protagonist was near the source of the contaminated mana and heard a scream. He realized the battle was getting harder, but he had already absorbed the mana, so he needed to hurry. Suddenly, a hidden passage opened before him. He looked down into a dark basement. The protagonist thought, are there enemies down there? But he decided not to overthink it and began to descend. A figure started to appear before him. He was then surprised to see that it was a child, and he wondered what a child was doing there. The cute girl saw him immediately and smiled. She started walking toward him and asked if he was a hunter. She didn't wait for an answer, telling him to follow her before running down the stairs. Junio reached out and shouted for the girl to wait a moment. How did she know he was a hunter? He wondered. The girl replied that her sister upstairs had told her a hunter would come to save her, and if that happened, they should lead together. She then asked, did Junio come here because he was the hunter who came to save her sister? He asked in surprise, who is your sister? The girl asked how her brother didn't know her. That was strange. She was sure he was talking about her. They went downstairs and saw a girl sitting there. She had a strange and eerie appearance. The girl said, we've arrived. This is the person I've been talking about. The protagonist looked at the girl in surprise. He thought she seemed to have suffered psychological trauma for some reason. He apologized, saying, the Hunter Association sent me. She asked again, is he from the Hunter Association? Did they really send him? The protagonist replied, yes. He knew this might be confusing, but he asked her to tell him what had happened. She collapsed to the ground in relief. Thank God, she murmured. Thank you. I was so afraid. Then the sad girl began to tell her story. She was the fourth scout to enter this dungeon. The first three did not return, so she was ordered to explore it. However, as soon as she entered, the dolls rushed at her from all sides. She was caught off guard and tried to escape through the door, but for some reason, it closed and wouldn't open. She was trapped. Janzi recalled how they had entered the dungeon and realized she had been in the same situation. He asked, do you know what happened to the other scouts? The girl replied, I do. She paused for a moment before continuing. I called out to them at the entrance to check, but something seemed off. It was as if they weren't conscious. They had a strange aura and looked terrifying. My former teammates tried to attack me. I managed to escape and eventually found this girl. Although she was trapped, the girl had helped her a lot. The little girl said it was true. My sister played with me a lot, she added. Judu asked, what's your name? She replied, my name is Elizabeth, but you can call me Beth. He nodded, it would be better for us to go together. It's too dangerous to stay alone here. The girl shook her head. It's dangerous inside, but I think it's much more dangerous outside. At that moment, the teen was fighting an invisible monster, running around the room, attacking blindly and hoping to land a hit. Sparks constantly flashed as their swords made contact with the monster. During the fight, Tana noticed that the enemy's boots were becoming visible. He realized the camouflage was gradually fading. Soon, the creature's figure and clothing became fully visible. He thought, are these humanoid-type monsters? He saw an identification card fall to the ground. When it became completely visible, he realized it was a scout's ID card. It belonged to Han Cholsung, a B-class hunter. Tan recognized that the attacker's face matched the documents of the scouts the association president had given him. Jui shouted, I also recognize that face. Mayhan continued attacking, while Tahan hesitated and only defended himself. Then he shouted for everyone to stop attacking. These are the missing scouts. Soon, the figure stopped hiding completely and cautiously observed everyone around them. Tahan knew that stealth was an ability that couldn't be used for a few minutes after activation, as it carried the risk of significantly slowing down movement. Suddenly, he was distracted by a shout. It was a Yoke, furious, glowing intensely with his aura as he screamed. He was convinced that this was a monster using camouflage. But were these really the scouts? He clenched his magic-infused fist and said that it didn't matter. Their speed had slowed down. He summoned a massive manifest and declared that he would kill them all at once. Ox struck with full force, but nothing happened. There were two teams and scouts on both sides of the long corridor. A drop of blood appeared on Ax's nose. He shouted in frustration, what's going on? G's weapon was smoking. He had fired a shot and now asked if Guildmaster Ik had gone insane. They weren't monsters. They were people who needed to be saved. There had to be a way to restore them to their original state. He asked, they're people. We need to restore them. When someone tries to kill you, there are only two choices, kill or be killed. It didn't matter who showed hostility toward him. Anyone would be eliminated. The sharpshooter was no exception. At the same time, the scouts' heads began to fall. Ayok's manifest seemed to fly through the hall, destroying them all. He glared at them with anger and said, they tried to stop me again. Ji should know that she would be the first to die. Maelngen shielded Zhao from both Ayok's punches, the chaotic mana, and the scouts. Jui shouted, you're a bastard. Tahan firmly told him to stop. He hoped Kim Ayok would listen now. Hayok said he was irritated that people were blind to the truth, but I'll show them reality. At that moment, the girl protected him with a shield and asked him to also repel the enemy attacks. Tan replied, this isn't a request, it's a deal. I'll hand over the mission reward and all the funding to the Shinhwa Guild. He thought these conditions should be enough. Ayak was surprised by such an offer. The scouts continued running around them, attacking. Ayak dodged a strike and warned them, if you annoy me, I'll kill you right here. Tan also avoided several sword strikes and thanked them for their patience. He thought he had finally bought some time. Suddenly, Hugh called out to him. Mayangan was blocking her strikes. Embarrassed, she showed her weapons and admitted, I did it. Tan, panting from exhaustion, said, you'll deal with the consequences later. Right now, we need to focus on the battle and figure out how to save them. The scouts turned invisible again, but in reality, they were the same dolls. However, there was an incredible number of threads in their chests. They were contaminated. Beth asked, did brother also see the dolls outside? This agreed that they are very scary. She didn't know exactly how, but the dolls were intertwined with purple threads. Their entire bodies were made of long threads. The dolls wouldn't die until the threads were removed. They would keep attacking constantly, but the threads were strong and very difficult to break. She asked what her brother and sister thought about this. Wasn't it scary? The protagonist asked. The dolls could return to their normal form. He wanted to bring back his comrades who had turned into dolls. The girl then said that she and her they needed to stop the device attached to the doll's body as soon as the thread was broken. But if they tried to remove the threads by force, the dolls' bodies would be torn to pieces. Big smiled and asked, did that information help? Did it really help? Jan Sewell began to observe her carefully with eyes filled with mana. It was strange, even a difficult question. She answered precisely and kindly. Maybe she should ask him another question, Beth thought. Only 20 seconds were needed. Just 20 seconds after the dolls used camouflage, they would die. The team continued fighting against the dolls. They were already exhausted, with wounds and blood showing on them. Now, everyone was being struck by the dolls, struggling to block the attacks with their shields. Jui shouted, this is bad. We can't handle this. Can Kang Yurine help? She just needs to freeze their movements or something. She snapped her fingers quickly, blocking an attack, and added, we can't push our limits any further. She was irritated by the situation. At that moment, Aop was already counting down. 10, 9, 8, 7. The team kept fighting through all the tens. His mana aura shone intensely, but he continued the countdown. He raised his fist, and in that instant, a gigantic mana fist hovered above his head, ready to strike. However, in the blink of an eye, the fist evaporated and disappeared. Aok remembered that this had happened before. The ability had been canceled and the pain from the past returned. At that moment, Judo arrived and said, "You interrupted your ability just in time. We barely managed to save the situation." He walked with a girl who was smiling widely and declared, "I'll take care of everything alone now." Todd approached and asked where he had gone. He replied that he needed to check something, but that there was nothing to worry about. The guild leader commented that it was good, that nothing had happened. Jiawei noticed something strange and turned around, seeing the blurred figures of the enemies. She shouted, "They're starting to use stealth again." The fighters began running toward the group at incredible speed, aided by mana. Tanin positioned himself to protect Janio and the frightened Beth, telling them not to move. Like bright beams of light, the enemies passed the surprised Jahi and Myangan, heading straight for the protagonist. Tan was shocked, thinking, "They went right past me." He shouted for Janio to be careful, but the protagonist was already completely calm. Thanks to the infected mana threads, two fighters attempted to attack him. However, Tahan appeared in front of them, blocking the attack with his sword. Juno's eyes gleamed. He said, "I can see the dull's weak points. I'll mark them now." The fighters should aim precisely there to avoid damaging the main body. Tahan replied that he understood. He looked up and thought, by marks, does he mean these blue fragments? He started using the hilt of his sword and struck. Directly at the fragment on the doll's chest, he aimed carefully. He was relieved to realize that this method worked. It was incredible to aim like this. He spotted another fragment and alerted everyone. The doll's weak point is the device in the center. We need to hit exactly there. Joan Han from Io's team struck a scout's chest with her spear. The device shattered and she shouted in triumph. Hyuk, displeased, questioned, "Why are the dolls breaking now when that hadn't happened before?" He didn't understand what was happening. The protagonist gave a subtle smile, and Aya continued asking, "What's going on?" Soon they stopped fighting the scouts, who were now unconscious. Tahan asked, "Can we know what Junio had been checking on the first floor?" Junio replied, "I'll tell you. It wasn't anything special. I explored the dungeon alone and accidentally found a surviving scout. She was in terrible condition, so she didn't come with us. But I learned what was happening from her and discovered the scout's weak points." Tan asked, "Who's the girl next to you?" She was looking at them with a smile, and Judio explained, "She helped me find the scout. It seems her parents are trapped here." Aok leaned toward the girl and said, "This is very suspicious." Joe questioned what the leader found suspicious about her. She was just a child. He pointed at her with displeasure and asked, "What's wrong with my reasoning? It's logical. How could an ordinary girl be here?" The portal was heavily guarded, and even if it seemed like she had been overlooked, a dissociation constantly monitored it. No one could enter. Tahan stated that he understood Joe's point, but added that judging her hastily was wrong. Became furious. He shouted, "You're all just obsessed with finding flaws in my words, aren't you?" Besides, Juno was walking around so confidently because Eok has let his guard down. Should I just kill all of Tahan's guild members? The leader of the Overkill Guild, Tahan, was also irritated. His eyes glowed with a dangerous aura. He said, "I don't like pointless arguments, but I find it necessary to teach Aodok the importance of discipline for the sake of a smooth raid." Joy declared, "Since you all think you're the best, you should use this opportunity to prove it." However, the girl beside her stated, "They really are the best." Annoyed, she asked Juai, "Why? Instead of talking nonsense, why didn't you try to stop your guildmaster? What would you do if he gets killed?" Jiawei, equally irritated, asked if they really believed Master Tahan could lose. The other girl countered, stating that her master definitely wouldn't lose. Chui shouted that she wanted to stop Tahan, but not before demanding that she stop saying that. And if he loses consciousness, would they even be able to carry him out? The argument between the two girls escalated. Their voices grew louder, and the aura surrounding them shone menacingly, taking on a toxic hue. Meanwhile, the guildmasters also began shouting, declaring that it was time to determine who was stronger. Giant fists and destructive flames erupted between the two groups. They shouted that they would show each other the truth of the situation. Suddenly, the protagonist felt pain. His aura began to shine intensely as he bent over, questioning what was happening. The emotions of the environment were growing stronger, almost uncontrollable. Then he heard laughter. Beth was laughing. Her aura was equally intense and dangerous. With a sinister smile, Beth revealed that she had only provoked their emotions a little, and they were already fighting like that. How shameful. Looking at Juno, she thanked him, saying, "Thanks to you." She was able to use her mind control ability on them without raising suspicion. It was necessary to approach discreetly, and he surely understood that now. At that moment, the protagonist remembered that from the beginning, he had suspected Beth might be a childlike monster. Her aura was murky and dark, but when he started seeing her as just a moral child, That was when he realized he might have been under mental manipulation. From the moment he met her, he quickly understood that he was already too late. Panicking, he ran toward the guild leaders, his own aura activated, determined to prevent the worst. However, as he approached, Juni realized he couldn't move. His body was wrapped in threads infused with contaminated mana, and it wasn't just him. Everyone in the area was bound by the threads, which led directly to Beth, who was manipulating their anger and resentment. The protagonist understood that they were all already under mind control. Who could have imagined that Beth was using contaminated mana to manipulate both body and mind? His eyes burned with fury. He couldn't accept such a deception. Forcing against the threads, Juno activated his passive mana absorption ability. Gradually, the threads began to fade. His aura shone intensely with the contaminated mana he absorbed. Beth had chosen the wrong enemy. Soon, the threads started breaking one by one, and the fighters snapped out of their trance. Someone asked, confused, what happened? With a sinister smile, Beth admitted, I didn't expect him to be able to absorb mana. Still, I find it amusing. However, Junseo shouted, Beth is the enemy. Attack her. Her smile faded. She began calling out for her father and mother. The air vibrated as powerful waves of energy cascaded from the ceiling, creating dazzling flashes of light. Beth pointed at the fighters and told the two new individuals, those people are intimidating me. Please punish them. Two imposing and beautiful dolls appeared before the combatants. Haeok immediately rushed to attack them. Tan tried to restrain him, but Ayak shouted, leave him alone. He'll destroy the doll with a single strike. With a snap of her fingers, Beth sarcastically declared, it's time for my brother to appear. At that moment, a controlled Aok struck one of his own teammates with a powerful punch, sending him crashing into the wall. Time, shocked, shouted, asking, what is Kemok doing? However, Aok wasn't listening. Contaminated mana emanated from him, and his mouth was filled with threads. He couldn't understand what was happening to his body. Junio was alarmed. Now it made sense why he had sensed contaminated mana in Aok's hand earlier. Beth mocked the situation. Her brother liked to hide behind humble people, but no one ever noticed. Laughing loudly, she provoked them. What will you do now that your ally has turned into a puppet? Tahan, irritated, gripped his sword. I will capture Aok, he declared. The other fighters agreed. The environment echoed with the sounds of strikes, gunfire, and swords as the confrontation continued. Suddenly, a barrier surrounded Kim Aok. Everyone, including Rubis, was surprised. Jay shouted, what's happening? A girl from the guild explained the barrier is an ability that activates automatically when the guild master feels his life is in danger. During this state, he becomes invulnerable and cannot be distracted. It's similar to a storm period. This ability could last for hours. You can no longer control Aok, and at that moment, the brother only wanted to be left alone. Beth, dissatisfied, complained, now one of us can't fight, making you useless. She declared, I only need to deal with the other three. The fighters positioned themselves in front of Aok's barrier, preparing for battle. Beth stated it would be better to finish everything quickly. Juno noticed that based on the energy emanating, these dolls were far more powerful than the previous ones, comparable to bosses in a difficult dungeon. The fight was inevitable. Ignoring these dolls would be dangerous. Although he had a bad feeling, Tahan decided that it was safer to face them. He instructed Mayong Joey, focus on the female doll while I deal with the male one. Jahoe, with her weapons ready, confirmed the order. The father doll was the first to attack. Taeyeon quickly wielded his sword, enveloped in flames to counter. Meanwhile, Aok remained motionless inside the barrier as if frozen in a block of ice. Rubis, unable to control or free him, was frustrated. The protagonist declared Aok's invincibility state has caused an error in our ability to control those who have become puppets. Despite being the same ability used to turn hunters into puppets, he stated that something felt off. Junior recalled that Aok had transformed into a doll instantly, even after he had absorbed all the contaminated mana. That meant that before his absorption, Beth had the opportunity to transform them, but chose not to. This made the protagonist suspicious. As he was thinking, Jia began fighting the mother doll, firing multiple shots that failed to penetrate the doll's barrier. Beth, watching, smirked with disdain. Junio was confused. Everything seemed like a game to Beth, but at the same time, something didn't make sense. Why had she revealed herself so obviously? Why hadn't she led the group to the lost scout and exposed the weaknesses of the other dolls? After gaining their trust, she had shown her true face, making everything pointless. However, despite thinking about it a lot, everything still felt strange. It was as if she were being forced to fight, a situation that didn't make sense for someone who only sought to create internal conflict. The father doll continued its relentless attacks. Tahan, dissatisfied with the doll's absurd resilience, wrapped his sword edge in mana threads and unleashed a powerful strike. He intensified his flames and activated his berserk ability. further increasing his weapon's power. Meanwhile, Joy, realizing that her conventional shots were useless, pulled out a special magazine with mana bullets from her pocket. She prepared her mana pistol, a weapon reserved for critical battles like this one. After concentrating, she fired an extremely powerful enchanted bullet. The projectile pierced through the doll's barrier, causing massive damage and leaving a flaming hole in its chest. With the mother doll severely wounded, she collapsed motionless to the ground. Shortly after, the father doll also fell. Tan lowered his flaming sword and took a deep breath, exhausted from a much harder battle than expected. The strangest thing, however, was that the dolls had only used physical attacks without any special abilities. Looking around, Tan realized that only one doll remained. He worried about mental attacks, but strangely, he could resist, so he warned the fighters to stay alert and prepared, instructing them not to advance without further orders. Beth, saddened, murmured, her mother and father have been destroyed. Tan was the first to advance against her. Beth held the remaining doll tightly, her smile suddenly twisting into something unsettling. She softly declared, "Everything is perfect." Tan reacted instantly. With a decisive strike, he ended the anomaly surrounding Beth. The doll slipped from her grasp and fell to the ground, leaving everyone in stunned silence. Yet Jahi, full of pride, remarked, "Did you all see that? We worried for nothing. That's exactly what we should expect from our guild leader." Irvin muttered in frustration. Beth acted as if something dreadful was about to happen, but in the end, it was nothing remarkable. Junio, hoping it was true, thought perhaps his ominous feeling had been wrong. But at that moment, a system panel appeared before him. Reading the information left him frozen in shock. Tan glanced at the damaged doll, the scene weighing heavily on the group. He was about to announce arrest when something unexpected occurred. Tan and the other 4 hunters stiffened, trembling in place. It wasn't magic, nor was it a psychic attack. Something was in the dungeon, something entirely unfamiliar. From the place where Beth had fallen, a strange substance began to take shape. Everyone felt the overwhelming presence of a monster. Junia realized he was right. As expected, a hidden boss appeared. It was the ancient vampire, Elizabeth Bay. On the system's taskbar, the main objective was clear: destroy Elizabeth Bay. As a reward, he would receive a demon shackle. The additional objective, however, was unknown. From the middle of the substance, a girl emerged, surrounded by splashes of blood. She thanked them all, stating that she had been waiting for those who would destroy her mother and father. She explained that they had betrayed her, forcing her to live forever. Her powers, she said, were useless, and they had trapped her in a body that she found pathetic. Stretching her arms and back, she joyfully declared that she was finally alive again. Elizabeth lamented that she had spent so much time harboring hatred against them while trapped in such a weak form. Yurin called to Jaoi and Maongan, ordering them to prepare for battle. She herself began to increase her mana. Even knowing her guild leader was talented, she knew it would be impossible to face Elizabeth alone. Elizabeth watched Tahan as he prepared his sword and mocked them, calling them admirable rats. Her provocative tone enraged the fighters. She then released a powerful flow of mana from her hands, an ability called Essence Strain. The ground was soaked with blood, and all the fighters began to cough violently, spitting blood. Mangan shouted, "This is absurd." Yurin trembled, blood flowing from her eyes, mouth, and ears. She knew that high-ranking undead were masters of absorption magic, but she had never seen it used at a distance and on so many people at once. Despite this, Tain managed to focus and launched an attack. His flames filled the space like a whirlwind. Elizabeth was surprised and admitted, even in that state, Tan can cause trouble. However, if he had access to all his power, things would be different. Elizabeth grabbed his sword and broke it into pieces with force. She declared, "You will never defeat me," and then struck him. Tan was sent flying, colliding with the ground and coughing up blood. Trembling and unable to stand, Junseo approached and asked, "How much do you think you've used?" Confused, Tan asked, "What are you talking about?" Junseo explained, "As a berserker, you have power, but your body won't withstand it if you use 100% all the time." He had the impression that he had used less than half of what he was capable of. Furthermore, he had been using even less afterward. Tan confirmed, but recalled that even so, the strongest sword Juno had ever made had been destroyed. In his current state, he wasn't sure if he could unleash a power greater than what he had already shown. Juno, however, extended his hand, asking if Tan was willing to share his power. He knew it was an absurd request, but he insisted anyway. Surprised, Tan felt the energy emanating from Juno's hand. It was mana, but it felt different. "Seems to be a permanent connection between us," Junio explained. He then became serious, enveloped in a dark aura, and declared that it was time to show their skills. He created demonic armor, and the system notified that 100 units of contaminated mana had been consumed. The system began searching for a suitable weapon in the demon world. Elizabeth watched them in surprise, and soon the creation was complete. A flaming weapon appeared before Tahan, a demonic sword leviathan. The protagonist declared, "Take the sword." Now she returned the berserker. Thus, the guild leader looked at the sword. Fascinated, he realized that something had changed. The mana was different. If the sword had many abilities, he would have taken it easily. But there seemed to be something unique about that flaming sword. So he extended his hands toward the weapon. It was a sword created by Junseo. As soon as he touched the sword, he was blinded by an intense burst of firelight. A strong wind blew toward him and swirled around him. Elizabeth also observed this massive explosion of power. She realized that this was a sword with contaminated mana. From the energy she felt, it must have been a special fire element ability. She said contaminated mana and flames make for a rather good synergy. The protagonist looked at Elizabeth in surprise. She was confident in her strength and was already preparing to attack. The synergy of mana and flames was indeed strong, but unfortunately not for them as she used blood. She pointed her hands at them. From her feet, a stream of blood flowed down the stairs and across the floor. This was the ability of the blood territory. When the blood reached Junio's feet, he became worried. This was a large-scale ability that seemed to drain energy. Although the absorption power was not as strong as before, it was still a very versatile ability. The rest of the team was already lying on the ground, powerless. Elizabeth said that their mana distribution and basic metabolism would gradually become paralyzed. Everything would melt: bones, muscles, nerves, veins. But all the team members were already unable to move, breathing with difficulty. The vampire considered them weak playthings. She said that after a while, the pain wouldn't be so bad. Suddenly, Tahan was in front of her with a flaming sword and aura. Elizabeth was confused and dissatisfied because even after activating her blood territory, he was still moving well. No, to be more precise, he wasn't moving well. His body was not being moved by his will or consciousness. It was the sword's ability. Even the strength he could display now, she thought, was much greater than before. She clenched her fist and said it was fine. Now, thanks for getting fun. Now she had to destroy the puppets. Drops of blood flew from Tahan's steps. He quickly rushed toward Elizabeth to attack. At that moment, she gathered all her mana using blood magic once more. When she raised her hands, two giant hands made of blood rose from the ground. This was the ability-thirsty hands. She pointed them forward. The massive hand quickly approached Taeyin. He gripped the sword tightly and swung it, sending a huge flow of flames from the blade, cutting through the hand. Now, even Elizabeth was frightened and questioned what kind of power this was. Right after, she immediately covered herself with another blood hand like a shield. She declared that she was twice as strong now. However, she explained that he had become even stronger than that. The protagonist was injured, but said he was truly impressed by this ability. Tennyden used his most powerful attack back, hitting the vampire directly. The room above and below was filled with blood. The guildmaster slashed Elizabeth's stomach. She coughed, her face contorted in pain. Junia was surprised to realize that Tahan had still been suppressing so much power, even though he probably didn't even know it. Soon, the room returned to normal, and the system informed that the main objective had been achieved. The hidden boss, the ancient vampire, Elizabeth Bay, had been successfully defeated. Now she was lying on the ground, lifeless and covered in blood. Suddenly, a small box appeared in Junio's hands. He realized that this was a reward item. He hoped the item was somehow related to recovery or magical activity. The system informed him that Leviathan's materialization had been unlocked. The sword in Tahan's hands began to gradually disappear, registering the demonic sword Leviathan. Next time he used this ability, a separate search would not be necessary. He could simply materialize it. Jumio wondered if it was some kind of search function, although he didn't understand how it worked. It seemed to look for a random sword, or maybe there was some logic to it. When the sword disappeared from Tahan's hands, he didn't understand what was happening. He felt very unwell and in pain. He was trembling and asked, "What's going on?" The protagonist approached and told him not to even try getting up. "Even if you did, you wouldn't be able to walk," he said. "Maybe you'll be fine, but you're so injured, and the power level is so high. I'm surprised Tahan is still conscious." Looking at the hall, he saw that all the fighters were unconscious on the ground. The protagonist added, "Tahan can rest now. I don't think anyone's life is in danger." Elizabeth managed to open her eyes. When Junio approached her, she said, "Congratulations, brother." The protagonist didn't understand anything since she was in a critical state. However, the system declared that she had been defeated, even though she was still alive. So he asked, "What is the story behind her in this dungeon?" The puppets were controlled by the same infected mana he had felt coming from her. However, at the same time, she couldn't control them. But still, they tried to protect her in the first place. Elizabeth replied they would certainly try to protect her because she is a valuable source of power that feeds them. A long time ago, she fulfilled all their whims, but while living alone, she simply killed huge and dangerous monsters. Normally, she wouldn't have done that, but one day she saved some rats that almost fell into the water. It was a family of 3. If everything had ended there, she continued, it would have just been a strange story. But that day, a woman came to her and bowed. These rats were unusual. They said they couldn't simply let their savior leave, so they asked her to accept their invitation. It was the first time she had heard something like that from a person. So she was taken to a beautiful mansion. The woman showed her a sphere filled with mana, and the man showed her giant dolls. Elizabeth paused as if remembering something, then said, I didn't know what the crit moment was. But when she realized it, she was no longer a guest. She was part of their family. She taught Rubus how to control the dolls with mana threads. It looked cute, so she laughed. Though it was brief, she was happy, until she realized why those rats had accepted her into their family. Even if it was for a short time, she liked to think that she had been happy before, until she understood the real reason why those rats had accepted her as part of their family. She declared that it was her fault. However, the fact that she had given them the chance to betray and then control her was proof that she had become soft and weak. So they trapped her in that body, sealing many of her abilities. That's why she provided the corrupted mana necessary to protect them. The protagonist asked what they needed protection from. Elizabeth replied that she herself wasn't sure. Although it was strange, she asked if he had ever seen the window in that mansion. Through the window, one could see a magnificent view, an endless desert that no matter where one went, never ended. But that wasn't a real desert, just a barrier and a space created to protect the property. She was certain that her mother had created that space with her power, all to protect them from the monsters beyond the rift. After those words, Junseo shuddered. Elizabeth noticed his reaction. He's been affected by the rift too, she said. That's how he ended up here. Their worlds had both been altered by the same forces. The rifts had torn through the sky, awakening mana, and many people, along with numerous portals, began to emerge. Through these portals, monsters came, beasts far crueler than vampires like her. Junseo immediately grew more interested. How did your world deal with the portals? She asked. What happened to the world? How many years has it been? Elizabeth was taken aback. You call it a disaster too? She asked, surprised. That was the conclusion, even though Elizabeth hadn't witnessed it firsthand. After being imprisoned in that body, terrible times came for her, times when she couldn't move. During that time, she had resembled a doll, lifeless and locked away. Her world had crumbled, the mansion isolated from everything. She could only move again recently. The lock on her box had been opened, and she was shocked. Since then, this had appeared before her, an unexpected development. Elizabeth looked at the system panel. There, a hidden task had appeared. She had to repel the uninvited guests from another world. The objective was to repel 100 of them, and the reward would be the liberation of the abandoned world. The protagonist was shocked upon hearing about the system window because it proved that she was also a player. Elizabeth understood from his face that he had many questions, but she apologized, saying she couldn't answer them. Her body began to disintegrate like a stone statue. She said her death was near, but that it was also a good thing. But Jude became nervous. This was bad. Her body was starting to collapse. At that moment, he remembered the reward. The item, Demon Shackle, was available. He opened the box, and its shining mana filled the air. He smiled. Soon, Elizabeth felt something and opened her eyes. Junseo quickly grabbed her by the neck, and an intense glow emanated from his body. Gradually, the cracks in her body disappeared. She asked, "What have you done?" The system provided information about the Demon Shackle. It was a forced confinement item usable on critically defeated monsters. He said, "This isn't a coincidence. I could have saved the Demon Shackle for another occasion, but I have a personal interest." The system informed him that after successful equipping, the corresponding monster would exit the critical state. A brilliant light shone. The rules indicated that the monster would obey the player who used the item as a familiar. Junseo commented that he had seen many players with familiars before, but this was the first time he had seen something like this, where the familiar was also a player. A notification appeared informing him that a contract had to be created with the ancient vampire, Elizabeth Bay. At that moment, a powerful beam of light rose before him, and the system notified him of the contract's creation. He shielded his eyes with his hand for protection. On the panel, it was written that the ancient vampire, Elizabeth Bay, was now registered as the familiar of player Shin Junseo. Looking at her in surprise, he said, "Although I expected changes in your appearance, this is a bit unexpected." Elizabeth looked at her own body and was shocked. She had transformed into a cat. He commented, "It's unexpected for you to be a cat and not a bat. Even your collar has changed sides." During that time, she paid no attention to what he was saying and continued staring at her body in horror. Soon, she managed to focus her strength, and an intense glow of mana made her return to her human form. Elizabeth said, "You shouldn't play around like that. Indignantly, she asked, "Did you really turn me into a familiar?" Showing her teeth, she tried to remove the shackles. "I would rather die than suffer such humiliation," she stated. The protagonist asked, "Is even maintaining a human form difficult for you?" He regretted it, but it seemed she had no choice but to accept the situation. The system notified him that if there was normal or contaminated mana and reserve, the familiar's ability lock could be temporarily deactivated. The protagonist commented, "You're a familiar who can't even perform a simple transformation. Why would I need you?" Elizabeth transformed back into a cat. She hissed and said, "As long as I'm under your control, we need to move forward." He picked her up in his arms, but she started swinging her paws and hissing. Juno was surprised. "You can still talk in this form." He wondered, unsure if that was good or bad. "It doesn't matter," he commented, "but have you really been deceived?" Elizabeth replied, "I've already told you everything." He placed her on the ground. "No need to repeat it. I've heard everything clearly." However, while listening, he realized some things contradicted each other. "You said those people stole your powers to survive. But then, what was the purpose of such a life?" He didn't know what had happened, but her family didn't seem very refined. He wasn't even sure if they possessed rational thought or ego. They seemed more like programmed dolls than living beings. Elizabeth replied irritably, "This isn't strange. People's psychosis adapts to their physical bodies. They ended up in that state because they were forcibly using contaminated mana. It's obvious that this would result in ego atrophy. Did you really expect me to sympathize with those fools?" Judio responded, "That's not what I meant. I was just saying that he, or most people, wouldn't continue living that way." With that, he approached a male doll and examined the body. If this person had switched bodies, then that was it. But as he observed the doll, he began to look surprised. Elizabeth watched him attentively. She asked, "What's wrong with you? Why bring this up now?" The protagonist positioned himself in front of the large doll and said, "I'm going to examine it." With one hand holding an org, he pulled Elizabeth toward him with the other, ordering, "Come to me." Elizabeth flew toward him reluctantly, thinking it was terrible to be forced to obey such simple orders. Judio commented that neither he nor she knew that was called an essence crystal. It was usually used in spells related to dark magic, saving mana and soul energy. He said that they had probably implanted something like that into the doll to give it a soul. Apparently, it didn't have enough power, but they were very technically skilled. Elizabeth became furious when he brought the orc close to her and asked, "What are you saying?" But then she was surprised and asked, "Is there no other way?" Suddenly, she found herself in a room in the mansion. She stood up for the first time. The whole family was seated in the living room. The woman said that in the past few days, she had seen several hundred, maybe even thousands of visions, but the result was always the same. The collision of worlds in recent years, the frequency would increase uncontrollably, even if they tried to delay it as much as possible. In 5 years, it would be too late to prepare for it. Beth realized that this wasn't really happening. It must have been a vision based on memories. Were these her father's memories? The man excitedly asked what she meant by that, the hypothesis of different dimensions, something she had studied so that at least her family could survive. The mother replied that, if Beth helped them, they could enclose the land around the mansion. There would be problems. If their world was destroyed, the mansion would be lost forever between two worlds. Only if someone from another world found them could this last for hundreds or even thousands of years. Perhaps it would take even longer, and they would simply wait to die slowly. The father covered his face with his hand, disappointed, and said it was terrible. Then Rubus said, "This wouldn't happen to Beth." His mother asked, "What are you talking about?" The boy asked, "How do you think we could live for a few more years?" Rubus cried, saying, "Beth's sister isn't like that. Couldn't we at least save her? Our family is alive only because of what Beth did at that moment. If this is a fate we can't change," he thought, "at least one member of my family should survive." But Beth would never accept being bound by strings. When her body was already wrapped in threads, she asked with tears in her eyes, "Why did you do this?" "Because I trusted you." They looked at her with regret and cried, apologizing, truly regretting what happened. At that moment, she transformed into a doll, and the woman took the spear. She asked, even after transferring their consciousness into the doll bodies, they would remain aware. Everyone held the spears containing their souls. And the man said they would retain their consciousness for several dozen or even hundreds of years. But after that, their minds would gradually fade. In 2,000 years, they probably wouldn't even remember who they were. But they would still be dolls. They needed to do this even if their dimension was isolated because they didn't know what dangers or cruel monsters might threaten them. Once they became large dolls, they could protect Beth from the dangers. They didn't know how long it would take, but they would do it until someone from another world came and took her away. The protagonist looked at the system panel, which indicated that he had used 50 units of contaminated mana and temporarily unlocked the abilities of the familiar Elizabeth Bay. Tears fell to the ground as Beth sat down crying, asking why. Why didn't they tell her? She sobbed. But Juno didn't let her finish. He spoke over her. If we had told you, we would have died together. It was inevitable. You would have chosen to die with us. Then he walked past her and said, "Get up. We don't have much time." She couldn't understand why he was in such a hurry. The system panel indicated that Elizabeth's abilities as a familiar had been unlocked. He said it wasn't a full recovery, but it was still quite a lot. 50 units of contaminated mana gave only 3 minutes, and he hadn't paid that much just to see her crying. He thought she should at least draw some conclusions. They had been dolls all this time, just to protect her and the ant. She should help put their spirits at ease. She screamed that she couldn't do that, but the protagonist didn't listen. He sternly told her not to be so weak. Their destruction and death had been predestined. They could have simply decided to live out their last days happily, but they chose otherwise. They imprisoned themselves for life for the sake of her future, something they weren't even sure was real. It wasn't for Beth or for Junio, but it was the least she could do out of loyalty to them. It was her minimum duty. Elizabeth clenched her teeth as she listened. Then, with deep pain in her eyes, she stood up. She looked at the mutilated dolls, and in her memories, she still saw a happy family. She added all of her regret and used mana to create a flame. Standing beside the dolls, she watched them burn in a wall of mana-infused fire. The system notified that Junseo had achieved an additional objective. He had discovered the truth about Elizabeth. As a reward, he received a mischievous treasure box. Elizabeth couldn't stop crying as she looked at the fire, while the protagonist received additional rewards. Soon, they left the dungeon, where doctors were waiting for them. All the fighters were injured and walking with difficulty, supported by the medics. Only Junseo was alone, sighing. "It feels like I've been here longer than I thought," he muttered. However, he felt uncomfortable saying that in front of Elizabeth. He asked, "How do you compare this world to yours?" Elizabeth replied, "I don't even want to compare. In Juno's world, not even the mana is strong," she continued, "but there's no choice. No matter what kind of place it is, I'll try to live a wonderful life there. It's my duty." It was already nighttime when Yuring, frustrated, declared, "I can't stop drinking because of this. Besides, today has been a terrible day for me." She looked ahead in displeasure, noticing the shadow of a person in her kitchen. "What's that rat doing there?" she asked. "Has he come to ruin everything completely?" She turned on the light, and the young man asked, "Why did you call me a rat? That's very rude. I've been waiting for a colleague and served myself." "Why?" Suffering for the long wait, she understood. Yurin extended her hand filled with mana and ordered him to stop talking nonsense. "Say a reason for your presence," she demanded. If he wanted to pay for the bottle he had opened, even his life wouldn't be enough. The executive replied that she was too rude, and of course, he wasn't there for personal matters. "I heard you went to an unranked dungeon," he continued. "I'm very interested in those. Rumors say it's a lot of fun there." After that, Yor told him something. The executive's eyes widened. "You saw nothing?" "That's incredible," he said, stunned. Who would have thought that she, a proud and hot-headed queen, would faint in the middle of a cleanup? Annoyed, she snapped, "Shut up. The situation has changed drastically." Although she had been unconscious, she saw the results of what had happened with her own eyes. Taein killed the boss with just 2 sword strikes, using the weapon the support had given him. Even considering the Berserker explosion, this was an unprecedented amount of mana. He clenched his fist. Everything's clear now. Those ranks are different. That means he's definitely worth hunting. But Yura shook her head. "I'm not sure about that. Taein was very memorable." But she thought they should focus on the support. The executive looked at her with displeasure and didn't understand. So she said, "I also thought you were just a D-rank pawn. I believe all you could do was create weapons. But that weapon could withstand Taein's full power if you also wielded a sword." He replied, "Of course, it's useful to know how to create a good sword. It wouldn't be bad to have someone like that by my side. But still, a tool is just a tool. If there's no one to hold the hilt, the weapon itself is useless." Their abilities were on opposite sides of the sword and the pure battle. The rest was just impurity. Yor said, "If I were to hunt Taein, that impurity would be the main reason for my defeat." But he was already leaving, waving his hand and saying, "Yes, a dank support that the queen is obsessed with. Although not as much as Taein, I'm now interested. Well, we'll meet again. By the way, I could kill both Taein and the impurity." A few days later, Juno was lying in bed, exhausted. He had slept for several days straight, but his condition still hadn't returned to normal. Actually, it wasn't because of creating the demonic weapon. He thought it was due to Beta's absorption abilities. He decided to ask, just to be sure, if there was any way to get rid of the side effects of his ability, but no one answered him. He started looking around the room and asked where she had disappeared to. He looked out the window, then got up with difficulty, stretching his body. "All right, everything will be fine. She's his familiar. He can forcibly summon her." Beth notes that very well, too. She must be interested in this new world until she starts acting strangely. At that moment, she was walking down the street, not allowing passersby to pet her. On Juno's desk was a mischievous treasure chest. He couldn't believe he was seeing that chest in real life because it was a mischievous treasure chest. It was a random reward that players frequently found. Although the chest released a random item, it wasn't 100% random. The item in the mischievous chest was limited to what the owner needed. The problem was that this mechanism had some flaws. For example, one could obtain a sharp and heavy sword that could only attack but not block attacks. A shield might drop that could withstand any blow without recoil, but randomly reflect the hit onto someone else. Regardless of the small flaws, the issue with these items was that they could be used. There were many cases of people trying to use items that somehow dealt with their flaws, but in the end, blood was still spilled. If the chest contained the item he wanted, then there could only be one thing inside, something that could restore mana or increase it by a certain amount. The type of item that could be there was determined. He opened the chest and a bright light shone. The system informed him that the wicked treasure chest had been opened. A dazzling light filled the room. It was important for him to know what weakness this item would have. The system informed him that the mischievous treasure chest was selecting an item for the player. Shin and Junseo. A bright flash appeared in his apartment, darkening even the sky, but it soon disappeared. In his hand was a ring. This is the trigger's gluttony, he thought, recognizing it. It allows the owner to use the mana absorption ability. He questioned what that meant. The system informed him that the mana leakage function was proportional to the target's positive attitude toward the owner. The protagonist threw the ring against the wall in frustration. "This is pissing me off," he shouted. And at that moment, Beth arrived home. However, the protagonist declared, "Mana absorption is a powerful skill, but it depends on my relationship with the target." And from the very beginning, he knew that something was strange. Beth said she didn't know why Juno was angry, but it seemed they had a guest outside. That idiot had arrived. He looked at the street, surprised, and asked, "Who is she talking about?" A luxury car was parked under the window. Aok stepped out of it and asked, "What's wrong with this place?" He declared that he couldn't believe Yan had placed his support to live in a place like that. Jun looked at him, confused, and confirmed that it really was that idiot. He took a closer look at his house and thought, although it's not ideal for him to want to recruit a support, he is worthy of it. Even without what Euron told me, I can feel what happened. Shin Jansu did something to Tahan, and the energy that emanated from him would have been enough to break the barrier and reach him instantly. I don't know why this guy is rank D, he thought, but he definitely has the potential to be at least rank A, if not higher. So Tahan didn't fully understand him. If he doesn't completely belong to Tahan, no, even if he does, I will make this happen. The protagonist asked, "How did you get my address?" No matter what options he had, there was no way he had obtained it legally. Ox stated that it all depended on perspective. Normally, many people would be amazed and eager to join the strongest guild. He asked if Judio understood, then extended his hand. Judio might have been expected to be impressed enough to greet him in person, but Junsu simply walked past, saying he was busy. Today, he needed to renew his assistant work permit. He turned his back on Aok, who quickly insisted that he would triple the payment. Whatever Taha had promised, he would offer far more. Aok grew frustrated, yet he understood that after what Junsu had accomplished in the dungeon, it was natural to view him as someone with remarkable strength, and for people with such ability, he was willing to provide special treatment. He declared that he could create opportunities unlike anything found elsewhere. At that, the protagonist turned around and admitted he was surprised by such confidence. Still, it would not change his answer. He would reply just as he had to Tian. They had nothing to offer him. Hayo clenched his teeth, saying the situation was unbearable. To make matters worse, Kang Yurin had done the same thing the day before. Yer bluntly remarked that all of them behaved so distantly that it was unpleasant, saying that he, Ayak, and the Shinwa Guild were just fools to them. Ayak watched Juno's back as he walked away. He muttered to himself that he and Urian would make both of them beg to work for him. There were ordinary passersby in a peaceful city surrounding Juno. He had planned to do this earlier, but the Hunter Association had said that getting there by public transport was quite troublesome. Most hunters drove, so it made sense. He bumped into a passerby and apologized. The man just nodded. The protagonist thought that he still hadn't fully recovered. The man passed by him and suddenly he remembered something. He immediately turned around. That face, it couldn't be. But maybe it was. However, the protagonist didn't see anyone else on the street. He expressed surprise upon realizing that Doom was alive. The man observed his confused state and called his name. A portal appeared between the tall, enclosed buildings. The man said that if preparations were complete, that it was time to go. In C rank and higher portals, even high-level hunters could suffer or die from a single mistake. They should know that. But when it comes to safety, nothing is excessive. The mage said she was worried because it was her first time in a C rank or higher portal. Junio was surprised by this and said Tank is a veteran. If they listen to him, there won't be any major problems. He added, although it's not my responsibility as an assistant to make sure they go to the portal with the girl. She replied, you seem experienced enough to meet Junio. Dojin observed them, his dissatisfaction clear. Shin Janyo, he muttered, a dank support specializing in creation. At that moment, the protagonist had already been questioned about his girlfriend, but he felt embarrassed. Dojin knew he had been a hunter for 2 years, but had only 1 year of practical experience. At the beginning of that year, there was the Dulin Guild, whose members radiated positive energy. It was his brother Mundoyan's guild. Before the past events unfolded, he and his brother were eating. Dojin asked, what kind of D-rank portal is that? Why are you aiming for a D-rank portal? Given your guild standards, shouldn't you be aiming for a C rank or even higher? Doyan replied, even though it's dank, the level is very high, and there are many resources there. In such dungeons, the benefits are incredible compared to the effort required. That's why large guilds frequently use them. Dojin said, dissatisfied, that it was too cheap. Even though guilds had a lot of money, D-rank portals were nothing more than pocket change for a large guild. Dojin replied, that's true, but not for a new guild like ours. We could still gain a lot, even if we only take half of what we expect. We can strengthen the weapons of the guild's most diligent members and train with exclusive equipment, not gear from other guilds. He assured Dojin, time is running out. Just wait. Soon the whole world will know about the Dawn Guild. Dojin remembered his brother's radiant smile, but his dream did not come true. One day he received a call and was asked, are you Dojin? He heard the unbelievable news from the association and immediately went to them. Indignant, he said, this doesn't make sense. My brother was at B rank, a recognized veteran. He couldn't have died in a dungeon like that. The worker replied, it was an unusual dungeon. I don't know what you know, but your brother was in a dungeon of inestimable value. The subsequent investigation revealed that it was a high-risk place. Dojin was shocked to hear about the unconfirmed dungeon. Then, he felt that his brother's death wasn't a simple accident. He said he had obtained that portal through an official auction and showed the document. He didn't know about the others, but Doom wouldn't lie to him. The worker asked, did Doon's brother tell you anything? He thought for a moment. Why? He asked. No. Who was responsible for that auction? He paused, realizing something wasn't right. He answered anxiously, my brother didn't tell me anything. He believed something had happened that defied common sense. The worker said, your brother's body will be delivered in 2 days after the investigation is completed. You're lucky we found him. There was a survivor who helped us collect the bodies. Dojin was confused. The worker confirmed, I don't know the exact circumstances, but it seems like the survivor just got lucky. The team was preparing to enter the portal. The team leader said, it's time to start. Let's go in and finish the raid without any serious injuries if possible. They began entering the portal, and Dojin watched them. He couldn't believe that all the hunters had died, yet a D-rank support had survived by mere luck. No matter how much he thought about it, if the support was involved in his brother's death, he needed to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The worker guarding the portal tensed up, extended his hand, and blocked the man's path. He wanted him to stay put since those hunters were participating in the dungeon cleanup, but the man confidently showed his pass. He said, I'm a member of the team. I just arrived late. He then added, let me see your passes. What kind of idiot would come fully armed if he had nothing to do with the dungeon? The guard hesitated, but let him pass. The referee laughed and said, you're lucky. The guard asked again about the strange phrase the man had mentioned earlier, but the man replied, I'm just happy to be able to enter. Once he was far enough away, the man muttered, everyone's lucky. If I hadn't made it, we'd all be dead. He approached the portal and asked, is the victim's name Moon Dojin? Now he would see the abilities of his candidate for hero. Inside the dungeon, there was a long, dark corridor with human remains scattered everywhere. At that moment, the team leader had already defeated a massive monster with a hammer. The system informed that it was a headless duke of B-rank danger level. The team leader, exhausted and panting, said, we really managed to defeat the monster on our own. Dojin, shocked, looked at the monster. Thinking that something was wrong, this couldn't be. It was just a C-rank dungeon. He declared that even if there was an identification error, it should be B-rank at most. He stated that if it had hidden its abilities until the end, it would be dangerous. The team leader said, our victory was possible thanks to Dojin. I never imagined we'd have someone so talented with us. Dojin replied, it's not quite like that. Despite helping, my contribution wasn't even half. He furrowed his brow and looked at his weapon, remembering that just a moment ago, the monster was still alive. All the team members were severely injured, and he also started to worry. This is bad, he thought. If he had brought his usual equipment, it would have been much easier for him. He was surprised when Junio asked, do you need a new weapon? Juneo extended his hand and said, I can make one for you in case you forgot about my abilities. After leaving the dungeon, Dojin was nervous. Such strength, cutting power, and weight. Its characteristics were several steps ahead of his usual weapon. His hands started trembling. He couldn't believe that a guy capable of creating something like that instantly was only a D-rank support. After the battle, he called Shin Juneo and asked, Who are you? The protagonist replied that he thought the guy could ask himself that question when they had met. He didn't know his name and had never told him his own. Dojin admitted that was true, so he would rephrase the question. He took off his mask and asked, Do you know my brother Junu? He's my older brother. Dojin continued, the leader of the Dawn Guild. He's been with the guild for a year. To be honest, he didn't care who Junseo was. He just wanted him to explain what happened to his brother a year ago. He didn't know if Junseo was involved or not. But before he could finish speaking, the protagonist tensed up. Multiple fire attacks from the monster were coming their way. Dojin looked worried, then blocked the strikes with his daggers, illuminating the area with a flash. He slid across the ground with sparks flying, fear tightening in his chest. Was there still a living monster? The executioner stepped forward toward them and said, This is an unexpected development. Although the rising star Dojin, whose best days were still ahead, was capable of handling this, he didn't think anyone else could have avoided his strike. At that moment, he looked at the rest of the team, who were dead and covered in blood. Only the protagonist had protected himself with a shield. The executioner hadn't even considered that anyone else might have survived. Juneo furrowed his brows. Dojin began to panic. He didn't know where that bastard had come from, but he was strong. Immediately, he threw daggers at him, but still, he didn't understand. Was he a berserker? Either way, this guy was talented, better than Dojin. The executioner smiled and said, There's no need to be so afraid. Just relax. He saw the protagonist putting away his shield and was surprised. Hearing there's a D-rank support, was he the impurity? He questioned. The protagonist didn't understand. What was going on? The executioner said, That's a real shame. I need this guy to defeat Yuntahan. But that didn't mean he could just let Dojin live. At that moment, the man prepared his daggers and thought about how he knew Junseo. But the executioner had already prepared a massive sword infused with dark mana. He decided to test if there was really something special about him. This hunt was about to get more interesting. Dojin was ready to face the attack. When the strike came, he jumped back amidst the flash and explosion. He realized the executioner had incredible strength. He could only hold out against him one or two more times at most. If he was hit by one of his attacks, everything would be over in a single blow. The executioner swung his sword again. A spray of blood flew from the blade as Dojin dodged and began running forward. If this was already happening, he needed to evade the attack and find a weak point. No matter what, the executioner swung his sword once more, sending a bloody slash toward Dojin, but the boy managed to dodge and soon dissipate the attack. This is annoying, he said in disgust. It seemed like the second boy was useless. This couldn't even be called a 2-on-1 fight. Hio said he was right. After that, the executioner suddenly felt pain. His hands were wrapped in mana threads. The same happened to his weapons. Beth appeared beside him, grinning as he remained trapped. She and Juno declared that it was actually 3 against 1. A system window appeared, indicating that at that moment he had no accumulated contaminated mana, so a penalty would be applied, reducing his mana. Blood began dripping onto the ground, and the system added that the summoning of the familiar Elizabeth Bay would be forcibly terminated in 10 seconds. The protagonist off the blood. Realizing that the mana he had obtained in a dangerous place wouldn't last much longer, the protagonist knew that time was running out. Meanwhile, the executioner, restrained by the threads, turned to Elizabeth with displeasure, tearing them apart. She watched him intently, her eyes cold and calculating. The protagonist knew the time he had left was enough to end the furious battle. As soon as the executioner freed himself, he shouted, Beth, you're a foolish idiot. He swung his sword, attacking with a blade of mana and fire. However, she barely moved. She just laughed at him because she had the mist ability. The executioner smirked. Beth, unfazed, said, It's a shame, but physical attacks alone don't scare me. She remembered Tahan. Although they seemed similar, there was a slight difference in their levels. But the main difference, she was certain, lay in their weapons. Either way, it seemed like a farewell. While the executioner was distracted by her, Dojin was already running backward, preparing mana and daggers. The boy tried to dodge and strike him with his sword, but Dojin left an illusion behind, getting very close to the executioner. In an instant, his dagger became incredibly long and sharp. He swung it, and the executioner looked at the blood. The system then informed that the summoning of Elizabeth, Bath's familiar, had been completed. She began to evaporate and said, This wasn't so bad either, though the ending felt a bit unfinished. Then she saw the executive looking at her with displeasure. One of his hands had been severed. Dojin stayed close, a little nervous. He thought that although the executive was difficult to kill, at least he could be seriously wounded. However, there was a significant gap in their basic abilities, and only in the current state did he have a chance. He said if the boy wants to live, he should drop his weapon and surrender, because considering his actions, the result will be the same. The executive listened with disgust and anger. He threw his sword to the ground. Even though it meant submitting to the enemy, Dojin soon realized that the man wasn't so simple. He had another plan. The executive placed the hand that held the sword into his pocket, then pulled out a shining stone. Juno was surprised to realize that he had charged mana into it, and the executive had already shattered the stone into many fragments. An intense light surrounded him, and a magic circle appeared beneath his feet. Dojin tried to attack, leaping at him with his daggers. The executive said, "We'll see each other later." And at that moment, Dojin struck the ground, creating a massive flash and a beam. He said, disheartened, "This is bad." That magic circle was for teleportation. The protagonist replied, "On the contrary, it's good that it was only an escape item. If it had been an attack or debuff item, regardless of the outcome, you wouldn't have made it out unscathed." Dojin turned around, surprised, but the protagonist interrupted him, saying, "I'll tell you about that day. I'll tell you what happened a year ago with the Dahlin Guild and my older brother. You have the right to know." They exited the portal, and the workers carried the bodies, watching them. Dojin said sadly, "I still feel terrible. Those people were killed by that bastard. We have to lie and say they were killed by monsters in the dungeon." But Juno said, "There was no other choice. According to the security team, they believed there were 7 in the team. A few minutes after they entered, someone with an access card arrived late at the gate." Dojin said, "That couldn't be." Juno confirmed it could. The unthinkable happened. The certificate was good enough to deceive security. No, maybe it was an actual pass. The protagonist remembered his excited team and Doyu showing the certificate. Just as he had said before, the same thing had happened a year ago when an unregulated dungeon was openly auctioned and certified. He didn't know their purpose, but it definitely wasn't something a small group could pull off. 2 documents were issued, the access permit and the proof of the auction agreement. If the association got caught, any organization involved would disappear. An important person hadn't been caught even after deceiving the association. No, perhaps it was someone so influential that even if they were caught, nothing would change. Juno was sure. He also had a general understanding that the scoundrels they were dealing with weren't ordinary people. So they lied to the families of the guild members, including his own. There might be someone among them who couldn't accept that. Dojin commented that if they officially reported this to the association, those people might suffer, just as he had said. Dojin understood everything. Now he was going to ask about Janu's ability. He realized that it made no sense for him to be a D-class creator. Why was he hiding it? The protagonist replied that it would be a long story, but before what happened a year ago, his ability was useless. He could only create 1 or 2 swords. It was so bad that he was ashamed even to be called D-class. However, a year ago, in an unregulated dungeon, he awakened a new ability while he was dying. Thanks to that, he was the only survivor. Of course, that sounded unreal. He understood. It might seem suspicious. If he were Dojin, he wouldn't believe it either. But with the main culprit and the secret behind it all were revealed, he planned to tell the world and their families. However, he justified the fact that he had hidden the truth by bowing and asking for forgiveness. Dojin stepped back, shocked. The protagonist said, "One day I will definitely find those responsible for Doyen's death." Dojin heard him and asked, would he really find them? The protagonist replied that he shouldn't act as if this was only his problem, without excluding the fact that he was also responsible for all of this. He couldn't provide answers to any questions. Now he was no different from Juno. Even after seeing everything with his own eyes, he had to remain silent before those who had the right to hear the truth. And he wouldn't stop until those responsible for his brother's death paid for it. He would get them at any cost. Until then, he was in Shin Juno's hands. From now on, they could only count on each other. At that moment, in the abandoned building, the executioner appeared within the magic circle. As soon as the glow faded, he couldn't stand for long and collapsed onto his knees. The executioner said they were repulsive. His face was tense with disgust. The priestess replied, "I don't know who you were talking to, but I understand. You're saying this after losing and running away. Wasn't this the scene that bothered you?" She mocked him, calling it a nightmare. "It would have been better if you had returned dead, or at least in a desperate state. Then I could have sacrificed you." The executioner wanted to protest, but the priestess refused to listen to him. "Don't act like that," she told him. "I still expect a lot from you." Even though she didn't know why, the man was startled when something glowing approached him. He looked at the unsettling substance and asked, "What is this?" The priestess told him, "Don't reject it. Eat it. This creature will become your new arm." The executioner started backing away, saying, "Don't come near me. Do you really think I'll take that unknown thing and swallow it? The priestess nodded, understanding. I know, she said. We don't have a relationship of trust, but under these circumstances, there was no choice. Even if it wasn't his main arm, losing any limb would be bad. She didn't know since she didn't use a sword. But how would he handle this with only his own efforts? The executioner took the disgusting creature in his palm, saying that suddenly something was about to happen. She replied, yes, you can do whatever you want if you can. The executioner swallowed the creature and immediately felt excruciating pain. He screamed loudly, his body trembling. The priestess, indifferent, said, that was incredible. It seemed that the two of them were much more compatible than she had imagined. She thought this process would take all night. Yet, this was only the primary form. The veins in his hand glowed with contaminated mana. After some time in use, the creature would automatically determine a more suitable form. If you don't like it, she continued, you can tell me. That creature is like a child to me, so you can do whatever you want with it. The executioner clenched his teeth in fury and decided he would kill them all. That irritating girl Mundojin and the boy who had cut off his hand. He especially remembered Junio with rage, vowing that he would kill him too. A special flight arrived at the airport. A crowd had gathered at the entrance. A girl commented it must be a celebrity arriving and suggested that he look at all those reporters and cameras. He replied, it's a hunter, and declared they're from the Himu Guild. She said, I've never heard of them, but why are they arriving through the airport? The guy said he had been reading articles about it. Apparently, they were invited to the United Kingdom because it must have been a highly dangerous and difficult portal. The reporters shouted as they entered the airport, asking Wu Kane, how do you feel after clearing the city at dawn? They had heard that she had received an incredible sum from the British government. Her assistant tried to shield Wu Kane from the reporters. They asked, do you think the country's top 3 guilds could compete internationally? The assistant replied, we won't be giving interviews at the moment. We'll answer questions later at the official press conference. As they were leaving, the girl commented, the guild leader did a good job. The day had ended. The day after tomorrow, they will have a press conference with the representatives of the Santa Guild at 11 o'clock a.m. By the way, 2 days ago, there were traces of the executioner. She was surprised and asked, where? He replied, 2 days ago, in the erroneous dungeon in Bupon. According to witnesses and the statement of the person responsible for the perimeter, someone appeared later than the others. Their characteristics matched the descriptions in the reports about the executioner. According to the association, there were 2 survivors. One looked at the basic information about the user's abilities on the tablet. There was the registration number, the name Shin Junio, and his position as a support. The assistant commented that the survivors were a B-class assassin and the second, a D-class support. One asked if there were any survivors and a D-class support. She then questioned how a D-class support managed to survive after the executive. She asked if the B-rank assassin's skills were good, but the woman stated that she didn't know. Although both had claimed that the deaths of their companions were an accident, one that could have happened during a hunt, one wondered why. There weren't any possible explanations. They could have been on the executive's side or threatened in various ways to stay alive. She asked to add this to her agenda. She wanted to meet with both of them. After all, she wanted to know what they could tell her. The protagonist was at home, sighing as he didn't think he would make it this far. And as expected, he found no information among the great sword users in the Hunter Association's records. There were 2 points. First, he was indeed an unofficial hunter. Second, he generally had a different appearance. The only thing he could be sure of was that he was connected to the extermination case that had occurred in the dungeons during the ranking era. Furthermore, the very existence of the dungeons from the ranking era could be the work of the organization to which he belonged. Even in the mansion situation where Beth was, everyone could have been exterminated there, including Yun Taein. He remembered Aok's fighting style. Judging by their skill and potential, everyone there could become heroes in the future, regardless of their character. If they were eliminated, it would be a huge loss for the future world. He closed his laptop. The fact that they hadn't stopped falsifying dungeon rankings and sending assassins, but were doing so separately, indicated the possibility that the assassins were operating outside the dungeons. This meant the situation was dangerous. While reflecting, he received a call. He answered and was immediately shocked by the voice. Are you Shin Janu? They asked. Soon, he found himself in a large, beautiful building. There, in an elegant bar, Kane Yurin was waiting for him. She said that when she chose the meeting place, she had expected cleaner clothes. Was I expecting too much from you? The protagonist replied, I've never been to places like this and I don't plan to. In any case, he had become increasingly suspicious lately. He didn't think his address and phone number were in the public database of the association. She asked, why are you talking about the address? Has that fool gone after you? Now it was clear what happened. He must have looked for him with an unpleasant smile and unfounded confidence. She seductively reached for his hand and said, don't worry, Jansu. I won't say anything as heavy-handed as that fool. I invited you out of personal interest. Have you come because you're interested in me, or is this business? She asked. You should sit. I'll pay for the drinks. The protagonist responded, this isn't a conversation that can be had freely over drinks. If you don't have anything special to say, I'll get straight to the point. Hinora said she was interested, but she didn't see what happened at the end of the last dungeon because she lost consciousness. She recalled Beth, cunning and strong, and asked, how did you defeat that monster? Even Tai-In, in his state, wouldn't have stood a chance. He replied, you should ask Tai-In, not me. I'm in D-class support with no combat abilities. And when she was unconscious, he couldn't do anything about the situation. He used all of his remaining energy to create a sword. That was all he knew. Urain smiled mischievously and said, I understand everything. Okay, she continued, what else do you want to tell me? They talked a little about recent events. Then Urain commented, although it's absurd, I find it funny. A sick little bastard with a great sword, roaming around hunting hunters. Could I be his next victim? The protagonist said, if my predictions are correct, the fact that we've entered a classified dungeon means you're their target. Among those who entered, you're the only hunter who doesn't belong to any guild. Urain interrupted him. So, they would attack me first? The only one without protection from an organization? That seems plausible. Aren't you forgetting something important? If we're talking about this, she continued, I'm not the only one. There's also a D-class support. He wasn't part of any organization or guild, and his abilities were much weaker than hers. If what he was saying was true, wasn't he himself in danger? She made a tempting and playful offer. What does he think? If he wanted, she could protect him. But Junseo turned around, saying that he had already said everything he wanted to, and then turned to leave. However, he asked her to take his words seriously because her life was in danger. She watched his figure disappear into the distance, then made a call. Urain said that Junseo had just left. He should do his best. This is his chance to repay his debt. Meanwhile, she had a mischievous smile, thinking about what would happen next. The protagonist was walking down a dark street completely alone when he suddenly stopped. The executioner asked, isn't it strange to say we haven't seen each other in a long time? He didn't know anything, but acknowledged Juno's courage. He hadn't expected him to be walking alone at night just a few days later. The executioner looked at him with disdain. Are you really an idiot? Irritated, he said bluntly, if you want to run or scream, it's all useless. You're already trapped. He was certain Juno hadn't noticed. They were under Manhwa, a skill called Dark Space. The executioner knew there was a priestess on a nearby rooftop and commented, the sorceress who created the barrier is very talented. As long as the barrier existed, no one would know what was happening inside. Whether Jonio or the executioner died, no one would have a clue. The protagonist heard all of this and indifferent, commented that it wasn't bad. The barrier didn't just block entry, was it based on the principle of creating a virtual space that imitated reality. Aside from the contaminated mana, he was a little concerned that he couldn't sense anyone's presence. He thought the executioner had killed all the people who lived there. That was a relief. Despite their abilities, his organization had a certain level of perception. The executioner didn't understand the kind of nonsense the protagonist was talking about, but the protagonist interrupted him again. Do you want to do anything else? He asked. In a way, he had already expected to be hunted, knowing that this could happen that day. He recalled his conversation and farewell with Urain, how she had said that he was the perfect person to be hunted. The executioner gritted his teeth in rage and asked, how could a mere support, who couldn't do anything alone, care to say such things? He drew his sword and immediately swung it, creating a massive blade of fire. He shouted, how could a useless support talk so much while pretending to be righteous? The enormous and powerful blade flew toward the protagonist, but he didn't move. When the attack struck him, a great explosion of mana illuminated the space. After the blow, the executioner stared at him. Juno stood before him, holding a massive sword that he had used to block the attack, glowing intensely with mana. He was shocked because this wasn't an attack like the previous one. Moreover, most people who had learned to fight would have already died. The protagonist put his sword away and said, this is the first time this year I can fight an enemy face to face without worrying about spectators. The battle with the ice monster was still fresh in his memory. The furious executioner began attacking, swinging his sword wildly. He asked, a support who isn't capable of doing anything alone? The protagonist replied, you're not entirely wrong, but it's better to see with your own eyes. His eyes shone intensely with mana, and he activated his skill, Grid World. Meanwhile, a car arrived at the scene, and Muyin stepped out. She looked around. Everything was calm and silent. She saw no signs or traces of the portal, but she could definitely feel the contaminated mana. Wuyin was of the same class. A class considered above average among supports, they typically use both regular mana and a special divine energy. Divine power was considered the opposite of contaminated mana. While some same classes couldn't see mana, they could sense it. Wuyin's assistant asked, should we report this to the association? Contaminated mana in the middle of a residential area seems strange and dangerous. But Wu Ying replied, no, not for now. She prepared her staff and began walking toward the barrier. If I don't return or make contact within 30 minutes, you can report it to the association. She filled her staff with mana, and it glowed intensely as she moved closer to the wall. The assistant watched everything, thinking it looked like an ordinary wall, but the guild leader could sense something. Suddenly, she'd almost screamed in surprise when Wu Ying began walking directly into the wall. Soon, the street fell silent. The assistant couldn't believe it. She couldn't see the leader or sense her presence anywhere. Anxiety grew as she began to worry. I hope nothing serious happened, she whispered. Inside the barrier, an intense battle raged, filled with ashes of mana and explosions. Juno's strong and powerful blades flew to attack the executive, who managed to block the strikes. However, at times, he barely avoided the weapons flying at him from the sides and behind. He angrily said Junio is an idiot, using ineffective tricks. Meanwhile, he dodged a grenade flying toward him. But when he turned back, he saw another grenade right behind him. The TM-38 grenade, used by the military against monsters, exploded. The protagonist watched the bright explosion and continued creating weapons. But the priestess was also observing him, trying to gauge how strong he was. If even the Empress bowed to him, he was certainly someone who could be a nuisance. There was nothing particularly admirable about the functionality of the weapons he created. They were just strong and sharp. But unfortunately, these qualities could only be demonstrated when wielding the weapons. They needed to be made with an emphasis on physical strength. She looked at Junio, surrounded by several spears and swords. Unbelievable. The creator of these weapons didn't just throw them. He launched them with such precision that the executive could barely repel the attacks, frantically swinging his sword. The speed, angle, power, and accuracy of the weapons were so precise that even an experienced executive struggled. Additionally, he created firearms and knew how to use them, always choosing the right moment in the right place. This wasn't just a good creator. Using abilities like that would be impossible without real combat experience at a veteran level. And yet, such a monster remained in the shadows, shrouded in a cloud of mana dust. The executive coughed. Meanwhile, Juno declared mana bullets aren't effective against monsters above C rank. He paused before adding, however, I can't say the same about humans. Strength and durability are completely different, especially if the attack is from behind. I don't even want to imagine it. The executive, completely covered in blood, was barely able to stand. The protagonist remarked, I've been through this myself. Maybe the guy would give up, but covered in wounds, the executive frowned, bared his teeth, and muttered, disgusting bastard. The protagonist, unfazed, replied, I only asked out of politeness. At that moment, the executive turned and saw, off to the side in the sky, many daggers pointed at him. He found himself in a terrible position. With swords rapidly descending on him from all directions, Juno clenched his fist. Then all the swords fell onto the executive, creating a massive explosion with bright flashes. The protagonist shielded his hand from the wind and dust, but then looked on in surprise. There was still a figure of a man standing before him. The executive dropped his sword to the ground, and his hand began to deform, transforming into something horrifying. The priestess cast a spell on him. I had to do it, she said, even though I would rather not. She spoke with disdain. My colleague is in danger, so I could help him. If I had known this would happen, I would have gathered more information to prevent it. Maybe I was being too greedy, but well, you should try anyway. Now, the executive's hand had transformed into a massive blade with a sharp tip. To protect himself, Junseo created an equally massive mana sword. He found it suspicious that the severed right hand was completely fine. But suddenly, contaminated mana of such a high level appeared. He hesitated, but still began to attack. His sword flew rapidly toward the executive. However, the man swung his transformed hand, and the contaminated mana blade easily sliced through Juno's sword. Splitting it in two, the protagonist watched the blade approaching and shot. He managed to create a shield that absorbed the full impact of the attack. Soon, the shield vanished, and the priestess commented, this won't be easy. Creating a strong weapon won't be enough. While it seemed the protagonist really did possess skills, she was surprised to see him pull out a special item from his pocket. Hazum had given it to him when they met. It was a gift to remind him of the contract with the guild leader. She had heard that he was searching for useful items in Arag's territory. The protagonist looked at the gift in surprise. Inside the box was Araken's bloodstone. This stone contained Arage's final screams. When used, it could allow the user to temporarily acquire the same class and rank as the one who dealt Irak's fatal blow, but only for 1 minute. The skills and rank would match the users, but after the duration ended, they would lose 99% of their remaining stamina. He had never imagined he would use it. As the executive prepared to attack, Juno swallowed the stone. At that moment, the executive started running toward him, screaming, but his sounds couldn't form words as if he were unconscious. Juno remained still, waiting for the entity to approach. Then he extended his hand to the side. The executioner screamed and swung his blade, but the effect of the bloodstone had already been activated. The clash of their attacks caused mana fragments and a blinding flash. At that moment, the system notified. For the next minute, Shin Juno's class and rank will be equal to Hands. The tense and furious executioner was shocked. Its attack had been blocked. The protagonist remarked, "Now I know what it's like to be part of a combat class." Both were struggling to contain their attacks, but the protagonist said, "We're moving on to the second round." His sword and body were engulfed in intense flames. He activated the explosion skill.